Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the really historic occasion for us in celebrating and reflecting at the same time in the context of the 50th year anniversary of the Herbert Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center, a cancer center that's been NCI designated for the last 50 years. And its existence is to a large extent due to the generous support of the Irving family that you'll hear about momentarily, and in particular the unwavering support of New York Presbyterian Hospital, the medical school, and Columbia University. So my name is Anil Rusky. I have the honor of being the director of the Cancer Center and representing our leadership, our members, our staff, and our trainees. And really, I hope you'll enjoy the proceedings this afternoon, and we'll guide you through the afternoon and the evening. I'd like to welcome our Dean, Katrina Armstrong, Dean of the Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons, Executive Vice President, CEO of the Medical Center. And our own professional journey has actually been in cancer genomics, genetics, prevention, and combating inequities in healthcare. So thank you, Katrina.
And Neil, thank you so much for having me. I have to say, this is an event. When I heard it was happening, I said, I need to be there. To be able to be part of this community as we hit 50 years of this remarkable cancer center has to be the highlight of my time. You know, I think I will just say three things very quickly. First of all, I think we all know that being part of a cancer center, cancer research, as any of us have come to it, really, I think, gave birth to what we think about as team science. It is the place where teams come together to make things happen. And so I just want to start by saying, like, there's no way we would be here without this incredible team. Obviously led by Anil, it's extraordinary. We're so fortunate to have his leadership. But I want to thank Richard Whitten, our board of advisors. I want to thank all of the people who lead our cancer effort. But I also really want to just take a moment and recognize and thank the patients who drive all this forward. Because the reality is, I think, as we all know, that we're here because so many of us have been touched or have experienced or cared for a patient or family who is in the midst of suffering from a cancer diagnosis. And I just want to say that I know that we come to cancer, we come to this 50-year anniversary with that team science spirit, and how absolutely delighted I am to be here and to be part of that. The last thing I will really say is just that this is a beginning. You know, Anil, we're here to celebrate, right? We're talking about a 50-year anniversary. But I think for all of us, and I'm not sure it's been 50 years since I started this journey personally, but it's getting closer and closer every day. I think for all of us, as we look at 2022 and beyond, I think we know there is a moment, an opportunity for us to come together in biomedical science, in the healthcare systems, in our medical education programs, and have an impact like we never, ever dreamed of. And that opportunity comes from many things. It comes from the investment in science that Dr. Sharpless at the National Cancer Institute, the AACR, that our partners across the globe have made over the last 50 years. But it also comes, I will say, because of the talent that is now coming to medicine and to biomedical science and the diversity of that talent. So we are now bringing people from across the globe to places like the Irving Cancer Center to be able to take on this in a completely different level. And we're doing that with an eye on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I think recognizing that we cannot cure cancer, we cannot move this forward unless we understand how to bring together a truly diverse community to have an impact on everybody who we serve. So I want to say thank you to everyone who's made this possible. But I also want to say, even as we're here, as you know, Anil, to celebrate 50 years, we're really here looking forward. It's going to be a great next 50 years. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Katrina. And next for our convocation is Dr. Laureen Hill. She's the Group Senior Vice President and CEO of the New York Presbyterian Hospitals and connected with Columbia from here throughout northern Manhattan, Westchester County. Herself, a specialist in anesthesiology and critical care medicine. And while she's going to look ahead and speak about the wonderful implementation of the new clinical cancer building, we would not have gotten through COVID without her courageous spirit and leadership. So, Laureen.
Hello, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be with you today. And wow, 50-year milestone, and actually a century, over a century, I think, of cancer care on this campus. And I can only imagine the grand plans and the bold aspirations of the early leaders and visionaries in cancer care here. So it is right and fitting that we are here to celebrate, and yet, as Katrina said, it's also about looking forward and continuing with a steadfast belief in our mission and how we go about that. So even as we are here to celebrate the physicians, the scientists, the teachers, the healers, the patients, every member of our cancer community, those who have led the way, we do recognize there's still much more to do. And we heard from Katrina about some of the ways we're going to do this in terms of how we focus on our people, our team science, the diversity of the people we serve, the diversity of the people doing the service. I think all of those are such important pillars of how we move forward. I wanted to share some exciting information with you about work that we've been doing together for a number of years, those of us at New York Presbyterian and in partnership with all of the marvelous physicians and leaders in our cancer programs to really improve our ability to deliver on the promises of the future. I think the theme for today was, a 50-year milestone and looking forward to advance research and advance care. And I will say our vision is fully aligned with the strategic priorities of the Herbert Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center, those being really leading in national reputation in cancer care, providing for that exceptional patient access and experience, innovating, leading in multidisciplinary practice, and integrating research into our cancer care delivery platform. So we are planning on building a new cancer building. We do call it affectionately Cancer Plus, and I'll explain the plus in a minute, but it is anchored by our cancer programs. And it will be sited on this campus. For those of you familiar with this campus, it will be at 165th and Fort Washington in the current location of the Eye Institute. So that grand building has lived its most useful life and will be coming down early next year. And we will be erecting a new 450,000 square foot building on its site. Almost 300,000 square feet of that space will be fully dedicated to cancer care. And it will include over a dozen floors of care delivery. We will have adult and pediatric cancer programs. We will have, I think, 5 or 6 floors of multidisciplinary practice space, coupled with the infusion services that those cancer programs will need to deliver. We will have ambulatory procedural space, whether operative or interventional procedure space. We will have a full suite of imaging. We will do diagnostic cancer screenings. And of course, we will have space, as I mentioned, for infusion and cell therapies and beyond. We will also be bringing clinical trials into this space, and so much more I could say. It will be a lovely healing kind of space. We will be redoing the garden, which will be adjacent to the building, so that our patients, families, and our staff members, our team members, can find peace and healing within the four walls and within the park and garden-like spaces that we will provide. So it is truly a wonderful opportunity for all of us, one of those generational kinds of things that we get to participate in. We're most excited, and Richard and I were talking about just a little earlier about this magnificent building that we're in today, and how the vision for this building and what it says about our commitment and our values related to education. Likewise, I think this building will be that kind of iconic building that will truly be worthy of the people and the care and the research that goes on in that space. So truly wonderful, wonderful opportunity. Today, we have two sets of architects working on that building. Ballinger is an architectural firm we have worked with extensively on some of our other beautifully designed buildings, and they really focus on the interior practice space. We want this to be the kind of place where all of our team members can practice and really be connected to that meaning and purpose and joy in their work. We also have Studio Gang is the architect that will be designing the exterior of the space. And for those of you that would like to go out and Google, this is Jeannie Gang's architecture firm. She has wonderful, iconic buildings throughout the world, most largely in Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and some here in New York. And so we are so privileged to have Jeannie and her team working on the exterior of the building. It will be visible from 270 degrees or three sides of the building, and we want it to represent the very special nature of this campus, of the work that will go on in the building and the people that are there to serve. So with that, I will conclude my comments. Thank you for the opportunity, Anil, to be here and to share some of these exciting updates. And I wish you all a great day and a great symposium.
Thank you again to Dr. Armstrong, Dr. Hill. So our symposium is divided into two components. The first one is more on innovations in science and technology. We'll have a break. And then the second one is more on precision prevention, community outreach and engagement, and population science. Each of these sessions will be highlighted by a keynote speaker, and it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Ned Sharpless as our first keynote speaker. Ned is a native of North Carolina, a Tar Heel, and college and medical school there, and then did his residency at Mass General Hospital, followed by an oncology fellowship at Dana-Farber, and then returned to North Carolina for faculty and becoming the director of the Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center there. And then he was called to serve as the director of the National Cancer Institute, and under his supervision and direction, the NCI grew handsomely in many, many different directions. And during that time, Ned also served as acting FDA commissioner, so a lot of hats, and it's great to have him. He's a renowned physician scientist in cancer and aging, apart from being a great leader. So please join me in welcoming Ned, and we have a commemoration of his visit here, and look forward to your talk, Ned.
I think it's important to note that really my first real mentor in academic research was Anil Rustigui when I worked in his lab sort of at the end of my fellowship, and it's so great to see all his success here and to watch the wonderful things he's doing at this storied academic institution. And Anil told me I had to stay on schedule, and he wanted me to talk about three things. So I'm going to talk about the National Cancer Act of 1971, because that's relevant because of the second topic, which is the Cancer Center program, of which this is a great example. And then lastly, because it's very much in the news and related to those two things, is the cancer moonshot, so what's going on right now in terms of federal government, in terms of the future. And I have slides, I think. A few slides. Is there a way to pull them up? Neil, is there something I'm supposed to be doing? No, that's not me.
So as I said, this first session is on innovations in technologies.
There we go. That's me. So first of all, happy birthday to the Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center. Many happy returns. This is a photo of President Nixon signing the National Cancer Act of 1971, and it was quite a thing. This was sort of the work of many, many scientists, doctors, and cancer advocates, Mary Lasker being among them, who sort of led the Congress and the administration to come together to try and make real progress against cancer. And this was a transformative law. It did really important things that still affect the cancer research mission today. And I think it is, when people sort of say, can Congress do anything for biomedical research besides give more money to, the NIH? Yes, it can. The sort of authorities and statutes and provisions of the National Cancer Act were really transformative. And one way to see this is, if you are director of something like the National Cancer Institute, you will go to a weekly meeting with the directors of the other NIHs, so heart, lung, and blood, NIDDK, aging, mental health, blah, blah, blah. And you will very quickly realize that the NCI is different from all those other so-called ICs because of the National Cancer Act. And it's not just because the NCI's budget is bigger, that's important, but NIAID's budget is actually pretty close. It's these things. So it's SEER program, which is this great national statistics database about cancer incidence. We don't have that in other diseases. I remember when I was being talked to about opioid epidemic, I was like, well, what do the data say? And I realized our data for the opioid epidemic are very poor compared to our data for cancer deaths in the United States, for example. It created the Frederick National Lab, which is this federal facility that is $800 million a year contract where federally directed research, namely cancer research, can be done. Absolutely a vital thing during the pandemic. It did a lot of the work that you know of as the federal response to the COVID was done at Frederick National Lab, for example. It created the bypass budget, it's called, so the professional judgment budget. It says that every year the NCI will provide a report directly to Congress, bypassing the administration and the usual HHS, the usual pathway, and directly tell Congress what do we need for cancer research 2 years from now. That document for this year came out today. And I recommend those of you who are interested in NCI funding to look at it. It's now online. You can see Doug Lowy's blog, for example, on this, the acting NCI director presently. But all those things were really, really important. But I think perhaps the most important thing the National Cancer Act did was create the Cancer Center program. And this is confusing to people because everybody's got a center program. There are Alzheimer's centers and cardiology centers and centers and centers and centers. But those centers are not like the NCI centers, right? This is a highly sought after federal imprimatur enshrined in law, and every institution wants to have one of these. I mean, the competition is ferocious. These grants are thousands of pages. They're incredible institutional investment. The site visits are legendary, and they're way underfunded. It's this institutional heavy lift for a grant that may not be that large by the standards of the institution, but it's because of this federal imprimatur and this awesomeness. They really just pay for the cores at the institution, but that is so important, and it has made this program really integral to the cancer research mission. And so if you look at cancer centers, they organize cancer research, they direct basic science and health services research and disparities research and prevention trials and clinical research and basic science, and they integrate it all into one thing, and that works really, really well. And the cancer centers serve as these hubs of innovation. And it is a great deal for the NCI because for basically sort of every dollar we give a cancer center of federal money, they raise in philanthropy and state money and licensing revenue and various sources, probably tenfold that I would estimate. So it is a really good use of federal funds to support the Cancer Center program, and I think it has really driven innovation in cancer. And I will not show data today. I could. But let me just tell you, cancer is kind of where it's at right now. If you look at FDA approvals, if you look at increasing survival, if you look at basic science innovation, you'll see that cancer research is really driving things. When I was at FDA, for 7 months, as my wife describes it, the worst sabbatical ever, I saw every approval of the agency. And I can tell you there's a cool thing here and there, like regenerative medicine, Spinraza, this really innovative SMA product got approved. The dengue vaccine, that was pretty neat. But cancer was weekly, new kinase inhibitor, first in man, cellular immunotherapy, novel biologics, vaccine approaches. It's really, the innovation is staggering right now. And so it is this sort of golden age of cancer research, if you will, what we started talking about. But I think all of that was set up by the National Cancer Act, and in part by creating the Cancer Center program. So one of the things now that is a good time to say is, given that success and this sort of 50 years of innovation, so the 2021 was the 50th anniversary, you know, what comes next? How are we going to continue to build on this strength and to make progress? And so President Biden has announced his support for what we've called many things, including the supercharged cancer moonshot. And this is to distinguish it from the original, presumably not supercharged cancer moonshot, or moonshot 1.0, but nobody likes that so much, or 2.0 or whatever. This is the second moonshot. The first one started at the end of the Obama administration. It really sort of launched, say, 2017. Its last year of funding is 2023. And as that is 7 years, $1.8 billion. And as that funding lapses, it's time to start to talk about what comes next. And so the Biden administration, to their credit, has really boldly said, you know, this is something we want to do. And I'm very, very supportive of this initiative. And I think it's, to have a president talk about this so visibly is wonderful for cancer research. Just to briefly mention, Moonshot 1.0, I think, was good. It was something the NCI administered. It was a very strong program. Dina Singer and I recently reviewed the topic in Cancer Cell, for those of you who are interested. But it's sunsetting, and so now it's, you know, what comes next. And the Biden administration has been very clear that it wants to be this all-of-government approach. So you see this picture here of the president talking to all of us sitting around the table. And if you know your federal employees, you'll see like Rob Califf from the FDA there. You'll see the Secretary of Energy. You'll see the Secretary of the Veterans Administration. You'll see the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. I mean, it's kind of everybody inside federal government who has anything to do with cancer research is interested in the cancer moonshot. So it's much bigger than just the NIH or the FDA and CDC. It includes, you know, this all-of-government approach. And a bunch of acronyms, half of which I don't even remember what they stand for. But they're all interested in cancer research. It's created a new agency, this thing called ARPA-H, which is now appropriated, $1 billion appropriation. And it, and presumably because of what I mentioned, the first moonshot finishing in 23, any new support to the National Cancer Institute for this would start in 24. And for those of you who know how the federal budget works, the president would tell us about that this February. So the president's budget comes out right after the new year every year, and that would be the time to hear about the plans for increased or different NCI funding. So this was an event from March last year. And the moonshot has a lot of goals. It's addressed cancer disparities, it's improved prevention and screening, it's, by the way, a very cool NCI funding initiative related to multi-cancer early detection tests, and the prevention and screening thing just came out looking for sites to do those trials, and it's a very exciting effort. And those of you who are interested in prevention and screening, please look at that new initiative that I think is, you know, the funding announcement's been live for about a month. But I won't go into all of the things that the Cancer Moonshot is talking about doing because you just don't have time. I thought I'd focus on one of the stated initiatives, and by far the most specific initiative, which is this one, which is the president's call to reduce cancer mortality by 50% in 25 years. So first off, this is very bold from a political point of view, to be so specific and give a time frame, and a time frame that's multiple administrations away is not how politicians usually work. Usually it's like, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do next February, not 25 years from now. So to have such a precise and well-stated goal, I think was very, very bold, and I fully support this, and I think it all gives us something to shoot at. But once you write something like this down, you can ask yourself, like, how would we do this? What does that mean? And so that's something I've been thinking about a lot. And I think another thing we have to say is this would be a big deal, right? Cancer kills a lot of Americans. If you reduce cancer mortality by half, that will really change the national experience of cancer. It won't end cancer as we know it, which is what the Biden administration has said is their goal, but it is an important, critical step towards that goal. And so this is a specific measure we could take that would get us down the road towards the president's goal of ending cancer as we know it. So let's talk about how you would do such a thing. And one useful effort is just to look at how we've done in the last 25 years. So I think most of you are aware, as I said, it's a sort of golden age of cancer research. And that is one of the pieces of evidence for that has been a pretty robust decline in cancer mortality in the last few decades. And that's for lots of reasons. It's tobacco control, it's better screening and prevention, it's new therapeutics, it's lots of things. And you can see in that really very successful period where cancer research is, I think, done quite well, we have about a 30% reduction. So, we'd have to do better than we've been doing to get to 50% in 25 years. And if you look by disease, you'll see like tremendous progress in lung cancer, right? And presumably that's largely, not entirely, but largely because of reduced tobacco usage over that period. But we can't do that again, right? We can't reduce lung cancer another 25 deaths per 100,000 because we've already done that, for example. So it's actually some of the, I don't want to say lung cancer is a low-hanging fruit, but addressing it through tobacco control is something that is going to be less successful in the future than it has been in the past, just because of the numbers. So this is really hard. I have the ratios here. You can look and see, and I think you'll notice if you look that most diseases, it's sort of 60, 70% reduction from 1994. A few things have gone up. They're in red. If you look closely at those, pancreas, liver, uterine cancer, they are cancers that are associated with obesity, which tells you the bad news, right, is that while tobacco control is going quite well, the obesity epidemic is going to become a very important determinant of future cancer mortality. Any way to meet the president's goal will require us to do something as a nation about the national obesity epidemic. I do not see any way the numbers will work if we continue to have liver cancer and pancreatic cancer increase in incidence and mortality, for example. But sort of 70% reduction, 31% reductions over that period. So that sort of tells you what's possible, and we will have to improve upon this to meet this goal. Here's a modeling exercise shown on the left. There is a graph at rates of reduction of 2%, 2.5%, 3%, 3.5%, 5%. And you see that around 2.5% decrease in cancer mortality per year times 25 years will do it. So the best we've ever done in any year in terms of annual cancer mortality is like 2.2%, and I believe that was 2 years ago. So the rate over the last 30 years has been about 1.5% on average, but the last few years it has accelerated. So this would have to take, we'd have to do better on average every year for the next 25 years than we have done, than our best ever year, a few years ago. And by the way, none of this is even talks about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on cancer outcomes in the United States, which is going to be, I think, quite significant. And the SEER data are about usually 19 months out of date. So any day we're going to start seeing the SEER incidence and mortality data from the early stages of the pandemic. And spoiler alert, I think it's going to be bad. I think those data are going to look bad. We're going to have increased mortality. We're going to have increased cancer death, delayed diagnosis. All of those things that we said would happen are going to happen because the pandemic was devastating. But once we can sort of get through that shorter term impact, I believe we can get back on the road to reducing cancer mortality at that kind of rate. And there are opportunities. So I've shown a few of those there. So more tobacco control. We've reduced tobacco usage significantly in the United States, but there's still a lot of lung cancer and esophageal cancer and bladder cancer. There's a lot of cancer death that we could still work on with tobacco control, and there are innovative ways to promote tobacco cessation and to stop adoption of tobacco products by children. So that remains a very significant public health opportunity. Better therapeutics. I think we've looked. So the CISNET network, which models sort of cancer incidence mortality that the NCI funds, did an exercise in breast cancer to look how much of the very significant decline in breast cancer over the last 2 decades is related to prevention screening, mammography versus therapy. And for that particular disease, the majority of the effect on breast cancer mortality is actually therapy. So you can bend the curve with therapeutics. They just need to be therapeutics that don't make you live a month longer, like some of the things we've seen, but things that really change long-term outcomes, like immuno-oncology has done for lung cancer, for example. So therapeutics is a place for some hope. I believe that, this early detection through these technologies that find cancer at very early stages is one of the most exciting and potentially one of the most dangerous things going on in oncology right now. The upside is tremendous. The downside is horrible. This is a very interesting space. So these are things like GRAIL and Thrive, Exact Sciences, Delphi, you probably know these companies. They use various technologies to find cancer at early stages. Often it's something floating in the peripheral blood like methylated DNA or some protein that's not supposed to be there. And they try and find cancer in healthy people. This is the funding initiative I just mentioned. That is, the NCI will set up a very large national clinical trial to evaluate these technologies. The NCI believes that mortality has to be the endpoint. It's not enough to find cancer with a cancer screening test. That always happens. You have to show that finding that cancer is beneficial to the patient. So exposure to the test in a randomized way leads to less death. You can do the math in your head very quickly and realize that's hundreds of thousands of patients followed for a long time. No one is ever going to do such a trial in industry, right? If that trial is going to happen, it has to be paid for by the federal government. But I believe the NCI and perhaps ARP-H should do that, right? That is something that the federal government could support, because that has the potential to really reduce cancer for all of us, particularly some cancers like pancreatic cancer and ovarian cancer that have been very difficult to screen for thus far and are highly lethal. And these technologies may show promise in that area. So that's something that's really just getting started now, but I think could affect cancer mortality at the population level. Cancer epidemiology I mentioned because, and this came up when I was talking to the students this morning, this is an area where, this is my shorthand, this is nobody else's shorthand, for really the interesting problem that we're facing in the United States about environmental risk in agents and cancer outcomes. And this is an area where I think there was a lot of exciting science early on in cancer biology, you know, carcinogens cause cancer and this mechanism or whatever. And this is something we've kind of gotten away from as a field for a variety of reasons. And now the questions are often highly technical and regulatory, like what's the threshold for PFAS in the well, you know, these kinds of questions. But I think new technologies like mutational signatures and expososome research and large data sets where you can look at outcomes in millions of patients through you know, scraping EHRs and this kind of thing, really provide a potential way to look at cancer at the population level and identify things we can do that we don't know about. You know, we know about obesity and tobacco control, but there may be other things we don't know about that might have an effect on cancer outcomes. And then a real opportunity, and a mind-bogglingly simple but also very difficult opportunity, is the dissemination of things that work. And I think, you know, as a medical oncologist, I was astounded when I started, you know, looking at the usage of specific agents that I was interested in and the variations of practice across the country. So there's things that everybody agree work that really help patients are not uniformly done. You know, and this contributes a lot to cancer health disparities. People with poor access to good quality care have less good outcomes because they're treated in environments that may not provide optimal care. So if we could just provide a uniform approach to care for certain diseases, I think particularly in vulnerable populations with low access, that's a terrific way that we could make dramatic improvements. And you look at diseases like breast cancer in African American women in Eastern North Carolina, outcomes are much worse. I don't think the biology is really different in that population. I think this is solely not uniform care among that population. And so you could make those statistics much better by having targeted approaches to reach those populations. And the NCI is very interested in this. There's some new technologies like telehealth and other, you know, big data and things like that that could be useful. But I think that remains a real opportunity statistically. And then on the other side, I have that sort of threats, the things that worry me a lot. Obesity, I already mentioned. I think persistent disparities, particularly one that has not gotten so much attention but is very concerning, is the urban-rural disparity. So in about 1990s, patients in rural parts of the United States did better with cancer than patients in urban areas. That has switched, and every year that gap gets wider for reasons we do not fully understand. Rurality is very hard to study. It's confounded by race and access and socioeconomic status, but it is bad-looking statistics. It is, you know, we have to figure out things that work, you know, in the Columbia Cancer Center, but also, you know, in upstate New York. We get you know, those brilliant therapies that are helpful but only can be administered in a tertiary cancer center are not really the solution solely. Regulatory backsliding, I am very worried. One of the things about being a former federal official as opposed to a current federal official is I can say I'm really worried about what's going on with accelerated approval. That has been absolutely integral to our progress in cancer research, and it is under attack. There are people who would like to see the FDA stop using that regulatory pathway, and that is because of Alzheimer's stuff that has nothing to do with cancer. 85% of accelerated approvals are in oncology. It is vital to our patients, and we shouldn't just say, oh, it's a dumb idea and we should stop doing it without really thinking about what that would mean. Underinsurance is a huge national issue and is really, I think, belies a lot of those access and vulnerable populations issues. And then I think we have to continue to fund cancer research, and that, you know, particularly good ideas in cancer. Pay lines for the NCI are lower than all the other parts of the NIH. It's not because the NCI doesn't like to give out money, it's because there has been this massive influx of grants into the National Cancer Institute. So the number of applications at the NCI from 2013 to 22 increased by almost 50%. That is more than the rest of the NIH combined, right? And that's because people have these great ideas of ways to address cancer, and they're coming to the National Cancer Institute with these proposals, and the NCI doesn't have enough money to get to all of them. So Congress has to support the federal research effort to really realize the possibilities. And good news, As I said, the bypass budget is out today, and you can see the NCI suggests a budget on the order of $10 billion per year in 2024 would be a good number. That's a big increase. The budget when I left was $7 billion a year, and this is 2 years away, so that would be a $1.5 billion increase times 2. That would be much larger than any increase the NCI has ever had. But cancer moonshots are expensive. You don't go to the moon for millions of dollars, you go to the moon for billions of dollars. The Artemis program is $96 billion just for, that is an actual moonshot program. I don't think the NCI wants $96 billion, that would be irresponsible. But certainly a couple billion a year would be easily handled in the National Cancer Institute for Cancer Research. And there is bipartisan agreement on this. So this is a very important Republican Senator, Jerry Moran, and a very important Democratic Senator, Senator Coons, both writing in Scientific American that we need to up the NCI's budget on the order of $1 billion to help us beat cancer. This is a good use of federal funds. The return on this is indisputable. I applaud these senators for taking this leadership, and I hope that the Cancer Moonshot can provide this kind of support. And by the way, so one of the most important people in this effort is Dr. Foti, who is really leading this national, AACR has been visionary in their support, particularly for the basic science of cancer research, because that's really hard to defend. Congress always wants to pay for clinical trials and very applied stuff, and that's important, and we like that. But supporting these basic initiatives that really move the needle in cancer research is critical, and we need funding for that. And so I really am very proud to be a member for AACR for a very long time because of their vocal advocacy on the need for basic science support. And I'll end with this lovely quote from Dr. Biden. This is my favorite federal official. Dr. Biden is a terrific advocate for cancer research. She and I went to many different cancer centers and small and large care areas to talk about return to screening and get your mammogram and don't smoke and cancer education. She is a very smart First Lady who understands the power of this office and how useful it is to communicate. So, the NCI director can tweet until the cows come home, but, one appearance from Dr. Biden on Good Morning America and like mammography rates go up. So she has been a terrific supporter for cancer research. And this is something she said at the February event, that we are living in this golden age of cancer research and we can end this terror and all of us have a role to play. And I completely agree. We can do this together. It needs support from Congress. It needs the bright and brilliant scientists in this room and the doctors who are taking care of patients and great leadership like Anil provides and Dean Armstrong. And all together, we can make a real difference. So it's an exciting time in cancer research, and we'll see what happens with the Moonshot 2.0. Everybody pay attention in February. So with that, I will close and not wreck the agenda. Thank you.
I'll take a vote. Should we have Dr. Sharpless back in federal government or in the private sector? So there's a brilliant talk and treatise. Thank you so much, Ned. Our first session, as I mentioned, is devoted to science, innovation, and technology. We wouldn't be here without the scientific contributions, the leadership attributes of our previous cancer center directors. Dr. Karen Antman, who's now Dean and Provost at Boston University, Dr. Ricardo Della Favara, who's Director of the Institute for Cancer Genetics and also co-editor-in-chief of Blood Cancer Discovery in AACR Journal, Dr. Steve Emerson, Emeritus President at Haverford College, apart from his Cancer Center Director role, and Dr. Corey Abadi-Shen, who is now Chair of Molecular Pharmacology and Therapeutics. So please join me in applauding their contributions. So our first session will comprise three wonderful presentations. I've listed those for you here. Each is preeminent in her or his field, and looking forward to these presentations. So first will be Gordana, Cancer on a Chip. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here. This number, 50 years, is so huge, and I really love that this symposium is positioned between looking back into the first 50 years and really looking forward into what can and should be done in the times to to come. I will start with a lesson that we got from Hippocrates, the father of medicine. He was the one who realized that cancer is a systemic disease, and he proposed that curing cancer can only be achieved if we take I'm sorry. Okay. So he proposed that curing cancer can only be possible if we take a systemic approach, if we consider the whole body instead of just eradicating the primary tumor. It's also interesting that he gave the name to the field. So what you see here are actually these finger-like projections of the evading cells, and it reminded him on a crab or cancer, and this is actually how the disease is being called today. Cancer is an incredibly complex disease. So we all know that it involves interactions of multiple cells, extracellular matrix, gradients of oxygen, many bioactive molecules, physical forces, immune cells, etc. Cancer is also an incredibly clever disease because cancers diversify, they evolve, they adapt in order to evade the ability of the body to actually fight them and to eliminate them. And finally, most cancers change in a very radical way from one individual to another. So when you put all this together, it becomes very clear why the field is pursuing this approach, which is resulting over the last few decades from the convergence of many different disciplines to really have this comprehensive approach to the problem, and why we are trying more and more to develop patient-specific models of cancer. So what we see in vivo in the patients, we're really trying to recapitulate in vitro using a number of different bioengineering and scientific tools. I will try to show you today that engineering tiny human tissues can be a methodology that can support cancer research. The tissues that we are making are very small in size, they look very simple, but actually they do have a capability of emulating, of recapitulating some of the organ functions. I will show you an example here. So what you see in this slide is a model of human leukemia on a chip that we start building by starting from a mineralized matrix that we populate by bone-forming cells, stromal cells, and vascular cells in order to form living human bone marrow. This takes about a month. After that point, we introduce into this construct where you have cells, different cell populations organized the right way and interacting with matrix, we introduce hematopoietic cells. All these cell populations are derived from the same source. You start from the very same induced pluripotent stem cells, so these are the cells you get from a very small blood sample, so it's genetically cleaned, it's patient-specific. After a period of time, you get a model of functional bone marrow where you can now introduce the patient's leukemic cells that are not processed, that are just harvested from the patient, and as you see here at the right, you end up forming a module of the human leukemia. Again, the module that has many helpful readouts and that is patient specific. So it's an individualized approach. The reality is, as we all know, that most cancer deaths are due to metastasis, not to the primary tumor. So metastatic cancer is this supervillain with superpowers to really evade any ability of the organism to fight this cancer. Metastasis is very complex. It involves many different steps, and then this simple cartoon here is just reminding us that it starts from the primary tumor. The tumor is shedding cancer cells, not all tumors, but some tumors do. These cells find their way through the endothelium of our vasculature, get into the vascular circulation, and then from there, they may go back through the endothelium to target one or more distant organs. It can be brain, it can be lung, it can be liver, maybe one or more of these organs. So it's very clear that modeling metastasis, building a model of metastasis, would really require having a combination of primary cancer cells, immune cells that are very, very important because of their interactions of the cancer cells and also with other organs. You need target organs that may be become the sites of metastasis, and you need vascular circulation. So this is now like a much more complex problem than what I showed you with like one single organ that we use in conjunction with the cancer cells to make a model. So this brings us to organs on chip. What you see here is actually a model that has evolved over the last 10 years or so by converging some of the advances in stem cell biology and tissue engineering in order to build controllable and biologically meaningful models of human physiology and human pathology. So to build the model, you start again from these induced pluripotent stem cells. They can be derived from any individual, and they have this ability to give rise to practically all populations that you can find in our body. So you will get the iPS cells, you will differentiate them into all cell lineages that you need to make the tissues of choice, because each of these organs, liver or heart or brain, will have many, many different cell lineages, not just one cell type. You make these tissues, you mature them in culture so that they can assume the adult-like structural and also functional features, and then you introduce them into these platforms like one tissue type per chamber. The next step is that you link them by vascular flow. So the difficulty in building these models, why did it take 10 years and not 1 year to get where we are now, is that you're really addressing two conflicting requirements. For a tissue to maintain its specificity, its phenotype, as we say, it needs to be kept in its own compartment with its own factors that are optimized for this particular tissue. Our heart and our liver are two very different environments. On the other hand, you want these tissues to talk to each other, to communicate. And the way we address this is actually to try to mimic how body does it. So what our body does is we are alive because of compartments and boundaries. This is the whole secret. So we place each tissue into one compartment. Underneath the tissue is endothelial barrier. Underneath endothelium, there is a vascular flow. So this is what you see here, and then just for reference, you see the size. It's the size of a microscope slide, or when we scale it up, this is really 96 well plate format. So you can populate this kind of tissue chips, organs on a chip, by many, many different tissues. So here is a menu of options that we have now that is constantly growing. We do have this ability to generate many different small-sized tissues, and we call them organs on a chip because they do have ability to recapitulate organ functions. For example, our liver tissue is recapitulating liver metabolism. Our heart tissue is recapitulating the contractile function of the heart. So it's really beautiful because you can pick and choose. And here are some of these tissues that are highlighted that are of particular interest for cancer research, such as bone marrow and liver. They're also we have metabolism, vascular cells, we have tumors, and we also have the immune cells. These platforms are very easily assembled. They're really plug and play. So you see here at the left in this little video, we first place these endothelial barriers, and then we park one tissue after another into these chambers, bring in culture medium, and when this is done, you connect them and establish perfusion. So these little dots that you see here at the right are actually indicating that what we may have in circulation, and these are cancer cells, immune cells, extracellular vesicles that the cells are releasing, and many bioactive molecules. And this is how these tissues talk to each other. They talk to each other by cells crossing endothelial barrier, and they talk by different factors that they're either releasing or receiving. So it sounds like very simple, and it is simple, but actually it does have ability to model some of the complexities of the cancer. And I'll give you an example of the study that we have been conducting using this model system. So in this particular case, we combined 3 tissues that are known metastatic sites for breast cancer. So this is bone and liver and lung. These are not all metastatic sites, but those tissues are known to be attacked by breast cancer cells. And we added heart as a tissue that is very rarely, if ever, attacked by metastatic progression. So we have these 4 tissues in this platform, and then into the vascular perfusion, we introduced primary breast cancer cells, and we introduced PBMCs, so peripheral blood, essentially immune cells, like the whole menu of immune cells. What we noticed in this system are 2 very interesting things. One is that different types of cells resulted in metastasis. And they would go into bone, liver, and lung, but these cells would not go into the heart. Not in one single experiment we had any invasion in the heart. Even more interestingly, when we used the cells that in the whole organism showed propensity, a preference for bone metastasis, we saw the same thing in the chip. Cells that were going to lung would also go to the lung, to the chip. This is very early, this is very initial. You see these examples of the bone tumor and lung tumor, but this is actually promising in a way that we see the cells being really smart and responding to the right cues that we are giving them. So there are possibilities to really develop different types of models for different types of cancers. To add 2 things, one is, as I mentioned multiple times, this is all can be patient-specific. So we can study cancer 1 patient at a time. And these tissues are very small. The number of cells that you need, cancer cells, immune cells, is very small. So you can get very far, do very many experiments with reasonably small samples that you can get from the patients. So let me now just loop back in closing to some of the opening remarks that we are also talking about next 50 years. And I was thinking, like, where are we going? Or like to enable people to do research that may benefit cancer research in the next 50 years. Here at the left, you see the platform as we have it today. This is it looks very pretty, but this is an artisan device. It is made for laboratory research. It requires a lot of training, and our students take time. They just get better and better using the platform. This is not the right setting for disseminating this platform, giving it away, to companies, to clinicians, making a little bit broader impact on the cancer research. So one direction of our research is today standardizing these platforms, making them maintain their many functionalities. They have sensors, they have like a lot of capability to monitor tissue function, but make them as easy to use as bell plates. So we would really like to make them user-friendly so that you don't need super trained bioengineer to operate these platforms. And finally, I think that these kinds of studies, which are really team science, which are being conducted in collaboration with many of our colleagues here at Columbia, many of our collaborators are now also here in this room, we hope that these studies will also help perform another function, which is a function of our research university, which is to train the next generation. So we are preparing people today who will be going out of graduate school and working over this next 50 years. So I would just like to close with this and really thank you for inviting me and thank you for organizing this really incredible celebration of the 50 years of the Cancer Center. Thanks very much.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lisa Kachnik, and I'm a radiation oncologist, and I've been asked to speak about artificial intelligence and its promise for the next 50 years for treating our cancer patients. So before we begin, we have to start with some basics, and I myself had to learn these basics. So what does artificial mean? So it means not organic, not inherent, made by machines and made by computers. So what do we mean by intelligence? At the most basic level, we think of intelligence as the ability to take in information, interpret it, and respond to it. But at the highest level, and probably what makes me most excited, it's the ability to create novel ideas, new paradigms, and really to ask, what if? And something my parents always said, break rules and go beyond the boundaries of possibility. So I know everybody knows Jeopardy, but does everybody remember in 2011 when IBM Watson was a player? He's the middle person. I know everybody knows Ken now, because Ken's one of the new co-hosts for poor Alex Trebek, who died of pancreas cancer a few years back. But in 2011, we had IBM play and beat the world's best quizmasters in trivia. But Cancer Care is a little bit different. It's really more complex than a game of Jeopardy. With Jeopardy, Watson had the perfect scenario. The question-answer format is specific and defined. One answer per question. But all Watson really needed was a lot of information to crunch, and through all of the data, they'd be able to get one answer, the likely answer to the question. Cancer Care, on the other hand, is far more complicated and nuanced. While AI does a really good job analyzing quantitative data, such as your lab results, it has a much harder time taking data, very nuanced data from a patient's chart that is rich in psychosocial information. Cancer Care is also constantly changing, and it's constantly evolving. Data from many, many years ago, and even 2 years ago, is far less relevant today because we have new drugs, we have new technology such as radiation, we have new molecular discoveries that have all been found. So just thinking about Jeopardy again, when there's a couple of possible multiple answers, here we have multiple treatment choices, and then choosing the correct one often takes into play a whole nother level. For me, example, it's taking the hand of my patient and having a long conversation about what are their goals of care and what's most important to them and their family members. And this is why Watson for Oncology hasn't yet delivered. But I'm not trying to be Debbie Downer here. I think I'm hoping to show you that the possibilities of AI are endless and even now quite exciting, because today we can use AI to really augment our ability to diagnose and treat patients along the course of their care. So at Columbia, and I was hoping he'd be here with me, but he isn't, but I'm going to speak to what my radiology colleague and friend, Dr. Larry Schwartz, is doing. And he's actually applying AI to standard of care imaging, which you can see on the right, to help predict how well patients with cancer may respond to treatment. So he and his team, and we have some in the audience right here, developed a machine learning algorithm that analyzes a patient's CAT scans as a method to create a biomarker or a radiology or radiomic signature. And that actually correlates with patient outcome. In this case, and you can look at the right panel with the 2 CAT scan images, the signature can predict which patients with metastatic melanoma, in here of the liver, will respond to immunotherapy. The goal here is to take predictive information and optimize an individualized care plan for each patient in real time, and tailoring that plan to the patient's individual biology and health goals. Our future hope, especially as applied to radiology, is taking this signature to predict cancer before it even begins to show symptoms, allowing us to treat that cancer at its most vulnerable early state when a chance of cure is at its highest. So I've shown you how AI or machine learning is really well poised to make a big impact in radiology, but what about the power of AI for what I do, radiation oncology? And for those of you that don't know, that's actually treating patients' cancers with very high doses of these same X-rays that are used by radiology to produce a diagnostic image. And in my field, we're just at the tip of the iceberg with AI. So this is taking me back to my residency also at the MGH. I think we have a lot of people here in the first row that have been there at one point or another. And I don't want to age myself, but I will. When I trained, I guess in the Stone Age, this is what I did, this picture right here. I took a 2-dimensional fluoroscopy that I got myself, image of a patient, looks like a box here, and then with a crayon, although many colors, I had my inner Picasso working, very long crayons, I actually drew the patient's tumor. I couldn't find my old film, so this one I had to take off the web. Mine were more elegant. But I would draw the patient tumor always in red, the normal organs in yellow, and then see those sort of purple blocks on here. That's where we cut lead blocks to prevent those areas from getting any radiation. But what happens is we treated the normal organs to the same high dose that the tumor received. So while we had cures, we also had a lot of toxicity. But we've made some improvements over the last 20, 25 years, and we've gotten much more conformal. We started using a CAT scan, and this is 3-dimensional fields from that. We still treated a lot of normal organs, but we knew how much dose they received. And then we went to actually doing this very fancy arc therapy called intensity modulated radiation, which more paints the dose to the tumor, and the normal structures are less involved, so side effects were going down. But I'm really excited because we've started using an AI-enabled machine called the Ethos that incorporates machine learning into delivering radiation for our patients in even a more precise and targeted way, potentially allowing us to treat the tumor more aggressively, which hopefully further minimizes the impact to the surrounding normal structures and decreases side effects. So again, the goal here is really more cure, less side effects. Right now, when a patient presents for radiation therapy, we make a treatment plan that takes into account margins of error in terms of targeting their tumor, margins for cancer cells we can't see, microscopic disease, and then margins if their body changes throughout treatment, such as they gain or lose weight, or even if they have a full bladder, a full rectum, or a full stomach. And creating this map or plan is very labor intensive. We don't have the manpower or resources to recreate it every day for a patient when they come in for 25 plus days of treatments. But what if we could create a new plan for every radiation treatment based on how the patient presents that day? We could safely increase the dose of radiation to the tumor, reduce that extra margin, and still minimize the amount of radiation even more going to the surrounding normal organs. And this is where AI comes in. AI has that computational power to do all this in minutes. And the busy work usually takes us about 5 to 8 days right now. So again, with Ethos, we take this quick CAT scan. I'm going to show you a picture of the results of the patient before we start treatment, while the patient is right on the treatment table or the treatment machine. And as soon as that image is acquired, machine learning algorithms start chugging in the background to detect any changes in the patient's physiology on that day on that table. It could be changes such as they had a big breakfast and they have a little too much gas in their bowel. And then the algorithm starts redelineating the normal organ and all of the normal organs and the tumor, and then sort of automatically pops up with myself or my colleagues on the console the whole time. And then we make adjustments to those structures, and then poof, a new treatment plan comes up. We review the plan. Usually it's better and we choose it. For example, don't know if it came out so well, but if we went with sort of the old plan from the original treatment, this is what we call a big cold spot in the middle of their tumor, which is in red here. And you can see with the adaptive treatment, it's super homogeneous, and I know it's getting like a super good dose. So then I choose that plan, and it's amazing because all of this happens while the patient was there from start to finish in less than 20 minutes. And when they go for their regular treatment, it's going to take that amount of time anyway. So again, with each day, they get a personalized treatment plan, and we're able to truly tailor that treatment to the patient, not merely adjusting the patient to match our initial plan. But what if we could incorporate even more data into that initial treatment plan, giving us insights on how to better treat that particular patient's cancer from day zero, the moment they are diagnosed? And what if we could sift through terabytes of multi-omic data, just like all of those nice slides you saw before, their imaging, the radiation information, to predict how a particular patient will respond to all of their treatments at our fingertips: chemo, immunotherapy, surgery, radiation, many, many more, and the optimal order of those treatments. And what if we could take all of that rich data and develop a dashboard of sorts, predicting not only the best treatments for the cancer patients, but what if they would develop cancer at all? So I think at this junction, and again, thinking about 50 years and 50 years, we're both very close, but we're still far away from this reality. I think the real issue is, if you just even look at the sort of cartoon here, there's just so much data, and that data is so complex. And cancer care, again, is not like Jeopardy, where there's a simple question and answer. Further complicating this whole issue is the fact that health data we are generating is both flawed and disparate. Healthcare systems across the US, although many are moving to Epic, many still have different electronic medical records, and the systems still don't talk to each other. Further complicating this is privacy policies in healthcare. Although they're very important, they limit the amount and type of data that can be collected and shared. If the data universe cannot be integrated, we will stay where we are now, with individual health systems, corporations, and companies attempting to make headway in this AI space in their own silos. There's also a question of trust and adoption of AI. The stakes in cancer care, again, are much more greater than in Jeopardy. And there was actually a study of AI-generated radiation plans, just like the one I just showed you, in Nature Medicine a few years back. And radiation oncologists considered that the vast majority of these AI-generated plans, 89 of 100, looked pretty good. But when it came time to sort of say, okay, am I going to use these, only about 60% said they would. Are we correct to be distrustful right now? Maybe. A 2019 study found that an algorithm widely used in the US hospital systems to allocate health care to patients was systematically discriminating against people of color. The fear that AI or machine learning can really exacerbate racial biases is very real. So how do we overcome all of these challenges and deliver in the next 50 years on the promise of AI in cancer care? I think the answer is I wouldn't say it's simple, but it's radical. We actually need to break down the walls and have transparency and communicate together. And I know this seems like a big thing, but we've had practice. We just got through the worst part of COVID, and we broke down, or all those traditional silos came crashing down within a few months. This isn't a space race. I think we will get there, but one institution won't solve the issue on its own. We have to really work together to make this a reality. Now I want to swing back to our patients. We really need to do it for our patients, and especially, just like Dr. Sharpless said, for our patients who don't have access to care, who don't have access to great academic institutions like Columbia, where we have a network of specialists, not just here in New York, in our own backyard, or in the US, but we need to do this across the globe, because that's where the real promise of AI is. It's providing that best quality of care to every person, no matter where they are across the universe. And being able to take all of this data at population levels and pinpoint the exact treatment plan, just like we do in radiation, that will work best for every single patient. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to present some of the research done in my department, my lab, to this August audience. I also want to say this is a little bit challenging for me because normally my talks are about an hour and a half, and designed specifically so that less than 30% of the audience understands what I'm saying. That's the only way to stay funded. But I decided to take up the challenge that Anil gave me. So I wanted to start by demystifying this idea of big data, right? So this is the SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Life Telescope in Australia. You can look at the Hadron Super Collider. Those projects generate exabytes. That's a billion bytes of information every week. All the data that cancer biologists have generated is probably a few petabytes. And in fact, the problem with this data is not that it's big. In fact, I would say that biological challenges are medium-sized in terms of where they stand on the longitudinal scale. But it actually doesn't fit anymore in an Excel spreadsheet. And that's been really challenging for biologists that used to be able to analyze their data in person. And so the other big problem is that this data is not big, but is extraordinarily complex. And I think Gordana did a great job. Why is it complex? It's complex because it's generated by molecular interaction networks inside cells, which are actually different from cell type to cell type, that have been honed by 3.7 billion years of evolution. And so it made it even more complex in cancer, because in cancer you actually have the additional problem that mutations that have never been seen by evolution in that particular configuration of patterns are now dysregulating these networks. And so I wanted to give you a sense of why, for instance, we have sort of abandoned a little bit the roadmap of going after mutation, because think of a poker game. So in a poker game, you get 5 cards. Every single hand is different. And in fact, you can have all sorts of different hands. And if you actually do the math, you will find that with a deck of 52 cards, you can actually get 2.6 million approximately different hands. right? So now turn that deck of cards, of 52 cards, into a deck of 2,000 cancer genes. These are about the number of genes that have been essentially have small or big effect on cancer. And now remove the limit of having only 5 cards. You could have 3 cards, you could have 100 cards. So that number of possible mutational patterns you can get is now larger than the number of atoms in the universe. So I don't know how many of you know how many atoms are in the universe. It's actually 10 to the 80. So 10 to the 80 is a big number. It means 1 followed by 80 zeros, right? So that's a challenging number. But when you actually ask how many patterns you could form from these 2,000 cancer genes, that number is actually 10 to the 400, and that's 1 followed by 400 zeros, okay? So the reality is that there are not enough atoms in the universe to even to let us observe the potential patterns that could give us cancer. And that's why I've always thought that using the mutation in the cancer genome to actually understand what particular type of therapy could be used works in certain particular cases, but it's essentially the tip of the iceberg of how these cells are dysregulated. So how do we address this complexity in a way? Sort of at some point you have to decide, how am I going to make the problem go away? Either I have, an amazing artificial intelligence or machine learning system that will actually make sense out of 10 to the 400 possible options. And I don't even know that we could actually staff clinical trials because every cells in the actual cancer mass of one patient has a different range of mutations, and therefore, in many cases, different sensitivity to different drugs. So how are we going to address this problem? So I'm a physicist by training, and so physicists don't like to use black boxes where there's an input and an output and try to build statistical association. What they like to do is to open the box, look inside, and try to figure out how things work. And so the way things work in biology is actually very complicated. It's complicated because I'm just giving you an example of one particular protein called NANOG. This is one of the Yamanaka factors that we study in pluripotency. These are the targets that particular protein regulates in just a particular type of cell, which is a pluripotent stem cell. And as you can see, some of the targets are actually activated by NANOG. They turn slightly red. Some of the targets are repressed by NANOG. And this, of course, will be very different from the way NANOG would work in a, say, glioma or would work in a blood cancer. So we need to generate these models for every single tissue context in which we want to apply our methodologies. But once you build these networks, which we can now do extremely effectively, so many people think that I'm a computational biologist. I'm actually not. So half of my lab is experimental, half of my lab is computational because you've got to put your money where your mouth is. And so we basically validate these predictions. We go to the lab, and we've shown in maybe more than 100 papers at this point that about 70 to 80% of the interaction that we predict using information theory are actually experimentally validated. And so this gives us a great lens because now imagine this single protein now becomes 2,500 transcriptional regulators and maybe 6,500 protein, including signal transduction protein, et cetera. So the kind of interaction network that you would get, which will have 1 million to 2 million interactions, would look like a fuzzy ball. In fact, I've been credited with coming up with the term ridiculome to describe them. And it's really impossible to glean any knowledge from these networks by looking at them. But when you put them inside a computer, these are actually tailor-made for a supercomputer to make decisions. What kind of decision can we make? For instance, we can ask the question, what are the proteins that induce a particular state of the cell that I'm observing right now? And I know that if all these genes that are positively regulated by NANOG are activated and all the ones that are repressed are underexpressed, I know that NANOG's got to have something to do with it. And so this allows us to really find ways to think about how the normal cell works. And in this case, you can see there are actually proteins called receptors that sit on the membrane of the proteins, that are proteins called signaling proteins that are in between the membrane and the nucleus. And then there are these proteins in the nucleus whose role is to actually regulate the genetics, the expression of genes. And so that's why I call the genome, we talk a lot about genes, but what are genes? Genes don't do anything. Genes that sit very prettily in the genome and are not very much involved in functions until they're actually transcribed into an mRNA molecule and then synthesizing a protein. And so we call the genome essentially the book of what could be, and we call the proteome or the transcriptome the book of what is, because the genome is essentially a set of ingredients, and until those ingredients are sitting in the fridge, you're not going to have a recipe. You're not going to eat a dinner tonight. You need a chef to do that, and the chefs in the cell are these proteins called transcription factors and cofactors that essentially regulate the expression of the good genes that actually allow the cell to perform its function and repress the function of the bad genes that would turn it, for instance, into a cancer cell. Okay? So this is very important because every cell has a different program, and in fact, the reason we have 20,000 genes and maybe 1 million protein isoforms is not because they're needed for the cell to implement this program. It's because you want to prevent the cell from switching its state, for instance, from becoming from a glial cell to become a blood cell. And so this is called it's called homeostasis. It's basically maintaining the state and function of the cell. So what happens in cancer? In cancer, what happens is that you start accumulating mutation, typically because you lose a tumor suppressors. And so the mutation are now these little explosions that you see here. And what they do, they dysregulate the function of these transcription factors and cofactors and essentially create a completely abnormal program of regulation of the cell. It's a program that it's never been seen in the context of a physiologic cell, and it ends up creating modules of transcription factor working together and regulating each other that are not physiologic. These are modules that are never seen in a normal cell, right? And the problem with this module is that now they activate all the bad programs and they inhibit all the good programs. For instance, they tell the cell to proliferate in an uncontrolled fashion. They tell the cell to stop responding to programmed death signal. They tell the cell how to attract populations that will abrogate the ability of the immune system to detect it. And so these are the proteins that we have actually focused on. And why is this important? It's important because what we have shown in many papers, one came up in Cell last year, and but there's probably dozens of papers that we published on this argument, that in fact these are the proteins that are responsible for integrating the effect of the genetics in their upstream module. And so what happens is that what these proteins do, they take these 10 to the 400 possible combination of mutation, and they turn them into a very, very small number of actual states that the cancer cell can occupy. So for instance, we have observed 112 different states when we looked at more than 15,000 individual tumors in TCGA, the Cancer Genome Atlas. When we go inside individual tumors, for instance, a glioma or a pancreatic cancer, et cetera, and we look at single cells, we've been able to identify anywhere between 2 and 11 different states, but never more than that. And so this is a very, very small number. So this is a little bit like a pachinko game, right? In a pachinko game, you have these balls that actually fall down, and because they have all these different pins, they can follow billions of different trajectories. Imagine each one of these trajectories being one particular mutational pattern that you may have. So, however, at the end of the game, the ball falls inside one of a very few slots, okay? And there's the silver lining. The silver lining is that, yes, the complexity of cancer is extraordinary, but what is possible is actually to figure out that many of these different mutational patterns, for instance, in triple-negative breast cancer, almost no two patients have the same mutational pattern, and certainly no two cells inside a tumor have the same mutational patterns. This patient will actually follow into cancer states that are virtually indistinguishable. Okay, they may be different, there may be multiple states in the same tumor, but the states is from a very small repertoire. And so what we've decided to do is to focus on the proteins that maintain these very few states. And I said, we were able to discover only 24 modules that are responsible for virtually all tumor types. And we've shown that when you abrogate the activity of these modules, these tumor cells die. Why do they die? Because it's like pulling the rug under the feet of someone who's standing up. They rely on these proteins to maintain the tumor cell state. You now remove it, the cell has to reprogram into a different state. And in fact, many of the things that we've done in collaboration with many people here at Columbia, for instance, is to show that we can use the same approaches in normal cell physiology to reprogram cells from any state we have to any state we want. Okay? And so what this leads to is that essentially we can focus on these proteins in these modules that we call tumor checkpoints, of which there's a relatively small number, as I said, and we can identify drugs by doing large-scale perturbational assays that will actually abrogate the activity not of just one target, but of the entire module. They work as an on-off switch, and when it's on, it's bad, or sometimes when it's off, it's bad, and you can literally invert the activity of all these proteins, leading to the demise of the cancer cell. And so This is intriguing as a concept. We now validated it. But I wanted to show why, in the previous talk we talked about artificial intelligence. Why is this different from AI? In AI and in machine learning, you use training sets. You use, for instance, you want to know how much time it takes a car to go from here to Boston. What you would do, you would start observing millions of cars moving everywhere. So you use your Tesla applications, and now you would measure how much time it gets. A car that goes a certain speed, a different speed, and now your model builds a regression model and can tell you exactly how much time it will take. Okay? But what if you know the laws of motion of Newton? You don't need to observe anything. You don't need a training set. You can start from first principles. And that's exactly what we do. Our first principle are, in fact, the regulatory and signaling and microRNA interaction and protein-protein interaction networks that we use. And these models give a very precise equation that are now so predictive that when we go to the lab to validate, for instance, whether a particular drug will kill a particular subpopulation of a tumor, we get it right about 80% of the time. Okay, so this is quite remarkable. And I want to say cancer is much more complex than this, of course, because it's not just a cancer cell. And cancer is a puzzle, and I think Gordana did a fantastic job in explaining the complexity not just of the tumor, which is in itself a mixture of multiple states, but in fact of the tumor microenvironment, which are the cells that the tumor attracts, because this requires understanding how, for instance, the tumors may secrete cytokine that can attract mildly suppressive population that can just block the immune system from seeing it. So creating sort of a cape of invisibility. And so we have to recognize that this complex pattern cannot be recognized by looking at one individual tassel or piece. It really needs to look at the entire structure, very much like what we do in this cancer center is not what the individual investigator does, although many of us do interesting things, but when we put them together in a collegial and really multidisciplinary interactive group of researchers, collaboration that lead to completely novel discoveries can emerge. And I want to end with saying that, this sounds like a lot of blah, blah, blah. How is this affecting the life of patient? It's actually, there are really good moments. There are good moments where we have two children, the only two children that were treated with drugs that were predicted by this methodology, Memorial. We basically predicted drugs that they would have never been given to these patients. They were untreatable by conventional approaches. They are now, both of them after 2 years, one has no sign of cancer, the other one has a dramatic reduction. It is one of the rarest tumor calcifying as a stromal epithelial tumor. There's probably 40 cases reported in the literature. They have absolutely no idea what to do. And now, just very serendipitously this morning, Nature Cancer just accepted a paper where we reported our very first clinical trial that is completed. We have two of them. Both of them have had 100% validation of the predictions of the specific targets that one should hit and the specific drugs of which to hit them. And so I would like to stop here, and thank you very much for your attention, for sitting through this.
Ask all the three speakers to come up to the front, and we'll have a panel discussion that's going to be moderated by Mr. Max Gomez, if he'll sit. And Mr. Gomez is a award-winning medical correspondent, having worked for both CBS and NBC. And he's going to moderate this session and another panel discussion in the later afternoon. So, Mr. Gomez?
So, good afternoon. Can you hear me all right there? Forgive me, I'm fighting a little laryngitis here, so forgive me if my voice is a little hoarse here. I am Dr. Max Gomez. I've been a medical journalist now for over 40 years, and in those 40 years, I've said that things have changed so dramatically. And a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to talk with Francis Collins, and I said, listen, I've been telling people that in the last 5 years, the advances in cancer have far outstripped the previous 30, 40 years. And he said, that's not only true, it is skyrocketing. And today, I think we have some good examples of exactly that research in cancer and how we're applying it to cancer care is just skyrocketing. Anyway, it is my pleasure and honor to be here today to moderate this. I am really happy to talk about anything that isn't monkeypox. Or corona or anything else like that. So let's focus on that. Since you were the last one, Dr. Califano, let me see if I can understand, or you can explain it to me. This is so complex, these interactions. How do you experimentally validate that? It's so complicated. What's the end point? How are you going to validate that?
So this is a great question, because when I started doing this, I mean, the very first network I validated was in collaboration with Ricardo de la Fabra in 2003 when I joined Columbia. And at that time, we had to do individual PCR reaction to validate just one target. And so we had, one of our faculty today, Katia Basso, who sat down very patiently and validated 11 MIC targets that we had predicted, and 10 out of the 11 were experimentally validated. We then done much more sophisticated validation where you can actually do mutational analysis of the site where the transcription factor binds, so that you can actually guarantee that it's true that binding that the target is regulated. But now there are really large-scale approaches. So we, for instance, can use robots or can use CRISPR approaches to actually, one thing that we've done recently is to silence all the transcriptional regulators in both colon cancer and gastric cancer cells, and then measure the RNA of every single cell. And so we can now basically see that in 50 cells that are the same transcription factor regulated, we can now validate which targets were moved by that transcription factor. So there are now really this high throughput methodology that we can use to do that. We don't do that almost anymore because it's great for predicting, but we are so certain at this point that we get 70 to 80% of them right. And we've shown that you only need 40% to be right before you can predict which one regulate the cells. So there's no point in validating too much anymore.
Do you focus on certain types of cancer?
My lab is an equal opportunity employer when it comes to cancer. So the last study that we did, which is now in review at Cancer Discovery, it's a study where we took 18 different malignancies, very aggressive malignancies, in patients that had failed to respond to at least 3 lines of therapy. We transplanted into immunocompromised mice and treated them with the predictions from the algorithm, and we got a 91% success rate with one algorithm, 68% with the other one, 0% when treated with conventional tyrosine kinase inhibitors or chemotherapy.
Dr. Kashnik, let me understand this. It seems like the AI that you've been using has been primarily focused on improving radiotherapy. Is that fair?
That is very fair.
Is AI doing something that it sounds like humans can do, but it takes them much, much longer? Or do you really improve on the outcome with AI?
Well, we don't know that. That will be the subject of funded studies moving forward in the next couple of years. But what it allows us to do is do it every day, because the patient changes, the tumor changes, the normal organs are in different positions. So by sort of making these changes every day, the sort of sum total hopefully will mean that the tumor was treated more aggressively and the normal structures surrounding the tumor received less radiation.
The key question here, which someone else brought up earlier in the discussion, I believe is Dr. Sharpless, is dissemination. You've got the ethos machine, which is terrific, but that's not going to be available to very many people. How do we take this and actually disseminate it so we can make a real impact on cancer? I
think it's for not just radiation, but for many of the things that we're doing.
So you can hope that by doing all of the homework, such as we did behind the algorithm, that someday in the next few years we can make that sort of public knowledge available, and that can be applied to sort of more than just the ethos in terms of radiation machines.
Is ethos, is that the only way or the approach?
No, there's different approaches to do what we're doing. There's some MRI-guided machines that do it. We just happen to go this way to sort of be different at Columbia and to be pioneers in this region. But there's different ways to target the tumor. We chose the AI way, just thinking that we can apply it to a variety of cancers throughout the body. The MRI way is better for specific cancers.
So, Dr. Novacek.
Gordana is fine.
Hmm?
Gordana is fine. Don't...
Oh, okay. All right, Gordana. Thank you. Cancer on a chip. Is that the same, similar, different to what I've always heard as the holy grail of early detection, a liquid biopsy?
I think it's different. I mean, maybe another way to explain it, in an ideal world, you should be able to just study cancer in the patient, to measure everything, but also to do perturbations. Obviously, we cannot do that. So what we are doing on a chip is actually a study of cancer that we do by providing, to the best of our ability, the context that this cancer has in the human body. So it's a more complex than working with liquid biopsy, but I think both of these are really important for advancing knowledge.
It strikes me that on this chip, when you were, the different cell types are talking to each other.
Yeah.
Kind of impacts on what Dr. Califano was talking about. It's a complicated interaction there.
Yes.
Can you guys work together on that?
We work together. This is with the reason. Actually, we've been working together for years, and I mean, you just captured the essence of it. I mean, doing experiments under the conditions that have high biological fidelity, that are meaningful, but then using this incredible expertise to make sense of the data and to understand what is really going on in different scales. We measure a lot of functionality that is at the organ and tissue scale, but then Andrea goes into the cell and deeper down, you know, to really see what are the molecules that are really regulating the behavior at the cellular level.
As an example, for instance, we're very interested in one of the biggest problems is why do cells get out of the primary tumor into the blood circulation and then metastasize to a distal location, right? This is very difficult to study in a patient because you have to isolate cells in the bloodstream. There are very few. There's like one cell for every million or multiple million of other cells. But in the system that Gordana has built, we can literally tag the cells and observe exactly how they go. So we can now ask, what are the master regulator proteins that control the ability of the cell to intravasate? And then what cells, for instance, what other protein can drive tropism to different sites, to different tissues? Why not go into the heart? Why go into the lung, go into the bones? Why do certain tumor metastasize to the brain or other?
Yeah. And maybe just to add one more thing along the same lines, one goal is what Andrea exactly described, to use this combination of experimental studies and analytical studies to understand, to advance our knowledge. Our other goal is to take cells from a patient and then predict, is this patient who has primary tumor of some kind likely to develop metastasis? And if so, into which organ? So if this can be done early enough, before metastasis has formed, this is really expanding the opportunities for clinicians to provide the most effective therapy. So it's really dual goal. I mean, one is scientific and one is very practical.
How do you predict that?
We predict that by, it's a little bit complicated, but essentially you will compare, you will study the cells from a patient that demonstrated metastasis in your system and see if you are recapitulating metastasis. And then compare this to another individual who is lucky enough not to have this propensity for metastasis. This is something that's not very easy. These are complex studies, but validation of these models are really being done looking into against the patient data. This is how you establish predictability.
Sort of using historical, if you will.
Right.
Historical, but also, for instance, one thing that we do all the time is that if you can predict which proteins determine the ability of a cell to metastasize, you can silence those proteins and show that they no longer do, right? And so, or you can predict the drugs that will prevent metastatic progression. And in Gordana's system, instead of trying in a patient, you can try it on the patient on a chip and show that the cells no longer are able to get to there. So there's a lot of both retrospective and prospective approaches that we can use.
So Lisa, this is obviously very, very complicated. How does AI, how can you take AI and facilitate, if you will, what they're doing, Gordana and Andrea?
Well, in a way, that's what we're all doing together already. It is sort of AI, and the beauty of Columbia is we all collaborate. When I leave here to take a break, we're writing a grant together about actually using all of these platforms to understand how radiation works. Because of, you said not to mention Corona, so I'll mention COVID. Because of COVID, even radiation treatments have changed. We've moved a lot to these 5-fraction, big, huge radiation dose a day short courses. But we don't understand why they work sometimes better or have sometimes less side effects. So I mentioned pancreas cancer because of poor Alex Trebek, but actually our grant's on pancreas cancer because it's such a devastating disease and why radiation doesn't work for every patient. But we're actually using these same platforms, which I would say is leveraging AI to kind of predict what proteins might be in charge of this reaction if they actually do respond to radiation, and then trying to manipulate and target these proteins to see if we can combine other drugs with radiation to make it more powerful. So I think we're at the sort of low levels of using AI, and I think as we sort of grow our tools, which again depend on AI, they're just going to become more powerful.
It also goes the other way around. For instance, we have a collaboration with the Department of Radiation Oncology with Kathy Spina, who's I think now in the audience, and she's been looking, for instance, at using the methodology we developed to understand precisely what are the changes that go on in the tumor microenvironment and how that is modulated by the radiation that the patient gets, and also, of course, in the tumor cells. So I think it is the nice thing is that all that you're hearing is really made bigger by having a cancer center that allows us to collaborate on this project in ways that would otherwise be impossible on just purely individual basis.
Gordana, you're nodding over here. What do you want to say?
What I want to say, I totally agree. I mean, Columbia is really an environment. What brought me here was that I realized it's very collegial, barriers for collaborations are very low. And like if you're a mathematician, you don't depend so much on collaborating actively with others. You can sit at home and do your stuff. If you're working in biomedical sciences, then I think it's critical that you find ways to work together. And this is not about exchanging methodologies. This is really at a very conceptual level. I mean, we do get ideas to test that we wouldn't get if we didn't work together. And maybe to add one more thing, I think a lot about it. For everything we do, it is very important to understand what can you accomplish by using these very sophisticated advanced tools, but then also to be very aware of the limitations. because our models are not equivalents of the human situation, you know, so you need to know how much is possible and what is impossible so that we can mindfully use the data that we are obtaining this way and translate them into patients.
So to put it in very simple terms, breaking down the silos that are normally part of, or often part of, biomedical research.
Right.
We are going to take some questions. If people, we have a microphone. I think we have one on either side. If you no, come on down, because otherwise we'll never we'll never hear you. And having done this many times, what happens often is the questions become a statement or a lecture. Let's have a real question now, okay?
Oh, I have a real question. It's about scalability at the population level. So when I'm hearing the talk, Dr. Kashnik, about it's visually seeing the tumor and making sure there's no cold spots and it's in real time, and that's absolutely amazing. And I can see how that's scalable, and you'd have to, you know, train technicians to really target it, but it seems very scalable. But then I'm thinking about when it comes to the tumor on a chip, there's so many other, as you were talking about, that there's adipokines, like there's obesity that's involved, and how can you model, let's say, someone who is very heavy and there may be adipokines involved and you're putting it through the chip. And then another thing, that means that also, Dr. Califano, when you have somebody, we're thinking about the plachinko, if you decide to give them a targeted drug and then that drug doesn't work as effectively, now your plachinko board has changed. In real time, will you still be able to predict prior to advancement what new drug? And then also population level, you're saying like maybe you have like 10 buckets it falls into, but what if at the population level there's 2 buckets that you haven't discovered yet because the population wasn't represented on the plachinko chip? So I'm just wondering from both of your standpoints, like the scalability at the population level for real-time effect.
So in other words, can you do this in real time as opposed to you do something, it fails, you predict, you try something else, it fails? That way, it's a slow way to go, but is that the only approach? Or is that the only way we can go after it?
I mean, sure. So it's a really good question. So I mentioned multiple times the patient specificity. So we are modeling male-female differences. We are bringing in the factors that are related to metabolism. You mentioned obesity. This is all very, very important because it's all about the context. It is impossible to study any of these phenomena that we are interested in isolation. The other factor about scaling up, I'm not sure which words you use, I think it's really important to disseminate these methodologies and chips and other devices to the very broad community so that people can directly study what they are interested in, and you can get many more data. We need to go out of the academic environments that are limited by the number of people and the volume of work that you can do.
So, and again, great question. So one of the advantages...
Wait, Andrea.
Oh, sorry, one of the advantages of using the RNA, we use the RNA to predict, we couldn't care less about the RNA, but we use it to predict the activity of the proteins, and the proteins are what run the game in the cell. One of the advantages is that this actually takes literally minutes, even on a laptop. Once you've developed the model, it's extremely efficient. And also it relies on sequencing data that is much cheaper than genomic data to acquire. And longitudinally, you can do this repeatedly. So we're limited, of course, by the ability to do multiple biopsies on the patients, but typically we've done this. In fact, we have a clinical trial right now here at Columbia called Hippocrates for pancreatic cancer, where we basically enroll a patient, get a biopsy, and the moment the patient relapses, we get another biopsy and see exactly how that patient has changed as a function of the drug. So the major limitation that we have is the time it takes to generate the sequencing data for the RNA, which is somewhere between 2 weeks and 6 weeks, depending on whether you're in COVID or not. Hopefully this now becomes much faster with new instruments that have been produced that allows you to have turnaround times that are even better.
And another complicating factor, as I understand it, is tumors don't stay, they're not static. They themselves will also change, and their genomics and proteomics and everything else will change. So it's a moving target.
So that's a bit of a misnomer, because what we have observed is we've done a lot of experiments with single cells. And before and after drug were used in a particular patient, what we have seen is that in the vast majority of the patients, what changes is the ratio between the different states that the tumor occupies. So let's say you have 5 states that you're starting from. So one state may have a lot of cells, another state may have very few cells, one intermediate cell. Once you give a drug, that state that had a lot of cells is now gone down and the other ones have come up. But very rarely we see emergence of a bona fide new state. For instance, in neuroendocrine tumors of the prostate, that is in fact happening. And there are other situations where you really reprogram the cancer cell to an entirely novel state. But the reality is that once you've seen enough tumors, the number of states that we keep seeing are always the same. And in fact, when you look at 100 gliomas, we were able to find only 11 states that were completely identical across all of them. And in fact, most patients had all of them. Right? So I think this is the simplification of the pachinko game analogy, because there's tremendous complexity upstream in how you can induce those states, but then when you look at the states, they're kind of very stable.
It's the ratios that are going to vary.
Right. So the problem with targeted therapy is that if you have targeted therapy, for instance, in lung cancer against EGFR, you will kill all the cells that have the EGFR mutation. Now you're left with all the cells that don't have the EGFR mutation or have been able to adapt to the drug. And so those cells don't really have anything really targetable that you can think of, and that's why patients succumb to the disease. But if you actually are able to design drugs that are not targeting one particular gene, one particular target, but really targeting the state of the cell, now you can develop combination therapy, as we're doing, for instance, for breast cancer and for pancreatic cancer, for glioma, where you can combine together drugs that are targeting different populations.
Lisa, let's talk about AI, because the computational power is, I think, a big deal here. And a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to spend some time with a patient, and it turns out her father was a researcher at Rockefeller. They were looking for the gene that is different, that's the driver of a particular cancer. And they had to recruit many different tumors, if you will, of the same type of cancer, and try to boil it down and look for what may be one or perhaps more, usually more, driver genes. Is AI applicable to something like that? That's a big number crunching you have to do.
Yeah, so again, I think we're just in the infancy of AI. I think it could give us some predictions, but cancer is just far too complicated. And even though there are many data sets now that find some common genes, there's always so many different ones that go up or down in each tumor type. I don't think AI can answer or help us yet. It can help us make some predictions, but we just find too many more things than what AI predicts.
Well, get on it. What are you waiting for?
That's his department.
Do we have any another question up there?
Just press the button.
Check. Okay, cool. Thank you for your time. Great talks. Question is for Dr. Califano. Identifying the targets are awesome and intriguing as far as maintaining these cell states. Are you finding that, what percentage of these targets you're identifying are druggable?
Oh, that's a terrific question. I want to make sure you understand. We Personally, we don't believe in individual targets. And the reason we don't believe in individual targets is because 3.7 billion years of evolution have made sure that the cell can actually withstand almost every single gene manipulation, right? And in fact, there are no driver genes in cancer, in my opinion, and there are genes that in combination with others will give you cancer, but there's not that I know, maybe Ned knows better than I do, but there's not a single gene that I know that with a single mutation of that gene is transforming. Even MYC or KRAS. KRAS is a very potent oncogene. It requires suppression of senescence pathway, otherwise the cell will automatically adapt to it. So what we try to do here is not target one target, but really exploit either the polypharmacology of drug or the fact that they can hit upstream modulators of these transcription factors that can invert the activity of about 25 proteins at the same time. And we've shown that this, in fact, the other clinical trial that we did recently and that had 100% success rate with Tito Fojo is in neuroendocrine tumors of the gut, and we showed that the drug colentinostat actually really inverts the activity of all 25 top master regulators and activates the bottom 25. So it's the target. It's a little bit of so the one disease, one gene, one drug. It's a little bit of an old-fashioned concept, in my opinion. Still works. There are some rare, very rare tumor in which there is single translocation, or like chronic hematological leukemia is a perfect example, and that mutation is 100% penetrant and is in every single cell. So the disease, in that case, this works remarkably well, but most tumors are not like that.
And how do you then find the drug that works against this?
Oh, that's very simple.
Big universe.
It's like shooting fish in a barrel because no, I'm just saying it's really remarkably simple. So what we do is we basically measure what drugs do in cells that recapitulate the master regulator of the patient, right? And so what we can do, we measure protein activity, so we can measure it before and after the drug was given and see which drugs out of 1,000 different drugs actually inverts the activity of the master regulators. And that's what we have done, as I said, for this study that is now in review and for the study that has just been accepted today.
I am getting the hook here from
I
Dr.
think you'll
Rutsky.
agree with me. Thank you, Mr. Gomez. These talks were awesome, weren't they?
To all.
And so we're going to take a 30-minute break if you can come back by 4 p.m. If you are proteins, you vastly exceed our supply of bathrooms, so just keep that ratio in mind. There are restrooms to the right, and there's one set downstairs. Thank you. Dedicated to the memory of Dr. Bernie Weinstein, former Cancer Center director and a true pioneer in molecular epidemiology. Our keynote speaker for this second session that's dedicated to prevention, chemoprevention, environmental carcinogenesis, population science. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Marge Foti, who's the CEO of the American Association of Cancer Research, or AACR, the largest organization of its type in the world, let alone the United States, that's dedicated to cancer research and cancer care. And for years, if not decades, Dr. Foti has been an inspirational leader in, as you heard from Dr. Sharpless, in pushing for advocacy for basic science research in a great partnership with the NCI, as well as translational components, clinical trials, a bevy of conferences occurring almost on a monthly basis, and advocacy in Washington, D.C. beyond. So it's a huge honor for us, as it was with introducing Dr. Sharpless, to have Dr. Foti join us. Thank you, Marge.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rutsky. I appreciate the honor of being here. It's really awesome to be here and see what fabulous things have been going on here at the Cancer Center, but also very humbling to follow these fabulous speeches that I've heard so far today. So I so much appreciate the honor of being here. It's very inspiring. So I first wanted to offer my personal congratulations to the Herbert Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center on the 50 years of spectacular accomplishments. I mean, in cancer research, patient care, education training, and DEI. It's just amazing. And I just wanted you to know that the world really lauds the dedicated work of the center and its leader and the faculty and staff. And in particular, I wanted to cite Dr. Ruski because, well, for a number of reasons. We're missing him very much in Philadelphia. I won't cry today, but inside I'm very sad, but very, very happy for the center. He's been here since 2018, and he's accomplished so much, rapidly applying his expertise in transdisciplinary research and translational research for the good of the center and for patients. And I wanted to just say that, especially listening to these amazing cutting-edge talks, it's clear that there's enormous transformative initiatives being put forward here at the center, and he and everyone should be congratulated on the track record of leadership and vision. So thank you very, very much for the invitation. So I couldn't help but hold myself back. I wanted to really talk about the history a little bit because in preparation for this talk, I did a little homework, and one of the interesting things here was, you know, this slide that we prepared dating back to 1933 when Wilhelmina Dunning and Mamie Rose Curtis developed the Dunning rat as a model to study tumor biology. All these things happening at Columbia. Virginia Franz and Alan Whipple, the first to describe insulin secretion of pancreatic tumors. Alfred Gellhorn, an AACR president, was director of your Institute of Cancer Research, and amazingly, he was really an early trailblazer for the inclusion of underrepresented population groups in medicine. And also, of course, Kenneth Ford, an early advocate for screening, which we're talking a lot about today, as well as workforce diversity. Richard Axel, Saul Silverstein, and Michael Wigler, all members of the AACR, developed a technique that allowed for the introduction of genes into mammalian cells, and my fave, Bernie Weinstein, AACR president, who had a wonderful laugh, didn't he? For those of you who might have known him, had a great laugh and a wonderful brain, of course. And he, along with Frederica Pereira, really conceptualized the new field of molecular epidemiology here. He was responsible for starting our new journal, Cancer Epidemiology, Biomarkers, and Prevention in 1991. I was there at the time. And yes, I've been around a long time, Dr. Ruski. And also Dr. Dalla Favre, who identified the BCL6 proto-oncogene and its contribution to diffuse large B-cell non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Dr. Dalla Favre is a leader of ours and a major editor-in-chief of our new journal, Blood Cancer Discovery, and it's really been delightful to work with him on a regular basis. And I have not met Dr. Chalfie personally, but it's amazing that he received his Nobel Prize for GFP as a marker for gene expression. So there's been a lot going on here, and many things after that. But one of the things I mentioned to Dr. Ruski while we were sitting there together is that the oldest paper published in an AACR journal from Columbia University was published in 1925 by a guy by the name of G.L. Rodenberg, and the title was A Theory of the Origin of Tumors. So 1925, think about how long ago that was. So you guys have always been working very hard to transform this field. So I'd like to give you a little history of the AACR and an overview of the status of cancer today, and also discuss a little bit about our shared responsibility to drive advances against cancer and the AACR's perspective on the path forward. So this year we're having a very special year. We're having our 115th anniversary, and I always like to remind people that although I've been around for a few decades, I was not there in 1907 at the beginning of this organization. Although I'm really thrilled that I have been over the past couple of decades, and I'm not going to tell you how many. You can look that up, I suppose. But in 1907, there were 11 visionary founders who gathered in Washington, D.C. and established the AACR to further the investigation and spread of knowledge of cancer. They didn't talk about cures in those days, but they just talked about getting together and talking about it and trying to do something. And it was at the very, very beginning of an awareness that we could actually try to treat this disease. And now we have over 52,000 members in 130 countries and territories around the world. When I first started, we had only 3,000. And it's growing rapidly, and a lot of young investigators are achieving great things. So as we commemorate the 115th anniversary in the same year as you're having your 50th, I wanted to say how we really all together need to celebrate our unparalleled progress made and really what we're doing for patients, and proudly represent the collective driving force for eradicating cancer. AACR is the largest, and I hope still considered the most prestigious organization in the world in all aspects of cancer research. Yes, we are focused on basic science, as Dr. Sharpless mentioned, but we are also getting to the clinic with our work, and it's a delight to see. But what's interesting is that if you look at the founders, for example, William Coley was among the 11 founders, famous now as the father of immunotherapy, and also 4 prevention scientists, mainly physicians, Gaylord, Greenall, Lerb, and Tisser, all of whom were working on various aspects of prevention, which is, of course, the subject of this afternoon's discussion. Very proud about that, because we have had now 7 presidents of AACR who have covered that area as well. And I'll name the Bernie Weinstein first, of course, Lee Wattenberg, who really first named the field chemoprophylaxis, which was later called chemoprevention, Louise Strong, Ki Hong, Phil Hite, Ray Du Bois, and Judy Garber. And I suspect that there will be more going forward, and we will be able to do more and more for prevention going forward. The historical evolution of AACR is very interesting in the sense that if you look at the 1907, there wasn't a whole lot happening. 33 people were members, less than 5 disciplines represented. That's what the field looked like in 1907. And of course, very few presentations. Look at that, only 9 presentations at the meeting, and at the annual meeting. And now when you think about it, over 6,000 are presented, 700 invited speakers, 221 clinical trials. So when Dr. Sharpless talks about the amazing progress that we've made, it's really it is awesome to think about the growth of the field, the growth of the publications, the importance of really thinking more and more about science, and that's why we are intending to form a scientific advisory council that will help the board think through the important scientific priorities going forward, because we feel the weight of the responsibility. We had 7 AACR presidents who came from this wonderful institution. And the one who's kind of interesting to me is Francis Carter Wood, who was actually president on 2 separate occasions. He's the only person in the history of the AACR that actually was president for 2 terms, and also editor-in-chief of 2 journals, also Woglum, secretary-treasurer, and also editor. These individuals worked very hard for the organization in the old days. And of course, the ones whom I knew well were Bernie Weinstein and Karen Antman at the time, and I still of course know Karen very well. They did a lot in their respective areas. I'm very proud to indicate that there are 3 past board members who came from this institution. I see Corey Abadi-Shen here. Congratulations on your work, Corey. And of course, Carol and Previs and Elliot Osterman. And there are now 5 fellows of the AACR Academy, and there will be more coming from this institution who were elected since this was established in 2013. So you're really getting a lot of recognition, a lot of great work is coming out of the organization. You saw the photograph on the left from Dr. Sharpless when the National Cancer Act was signed, but you didn't see the one on the right, which is, I have no idea who took this, but I'm so happy because there were 5 past presidents at the time standing outside waiting to go in to see this momentous event. Arthur Upton ultimately became NCI director, and Jacob Firth, of course, came from here, and Jim Holland, Joe Birchinall, and Sidney Winehouse, Sidney being my mentor for many years, were there having a good time. And I remember them talking about this experience after the fact, so it was quite a special moment. At this wonderful institution, there are 75 AACR, we call them active, but they're relatively senior members who are junior faculty and up, members at this cancer center with a broad range of scientific and clinical expertise. And I put in green those with whom I have personally been involved, most recently, even Sandra Riom, who was actually from Philadelphia, but also others on this list who have done so much to help and continue to help us. Gary Schwartz is on a task force. It goes on, and I hope that others of you will be active, will become active, because we need you. We need you for the breadth of coverage that we have. There are 254 total members coming from here, and that number could be much higher, so I'm pitching, okay? So we'll see. By the way, we lose money on every member. We lose money on every member, so it's not a money issue. The status of cancer today is that we should be very happy that we have increased the number of cancer survivors from 3 million to over 18 million this year, with a 32% reduction in the cancer death rate. And a lot of this is due to the 5 pillars of treatment. Interestingly, and I knew Fred Phillip, who would talk to me about the early days of chemotherapy, and of course, Barney Clarkson, who's now in his 90s, who were working in the area of cytotoxic chemotherapy in the old days. And now we have more sophisticated pillars here in molecular targeted therapies and immunotherapy. But, just suffice it to say that we're at a very exciting juncture, as has been discussed all day long, in accelerating advances across the continuum of patient care and research. And there are many, many new and exciting opportunities for confronting this complex disease. I wanted to just mention a couple very quickly. The Philadelphia chromosome was discovered by a number of guys at Penn in 1960, and it really took 38 years from the initial discovery of the molecular underpinnings of CML to the first clinical trials to test Gleevec. We can't afford to wait 38 years anymore, but of course we're happy that now there is an acceleration of this and subsequent generations of these drugs, including the most recent BCR-ABL targeted agent, have really been rapidly developed to treat resistance mutations, which, as you know, are bad things and can cause recurrence and more aggressive aspects. I also wanted to mention the human KRAS gene that was cloned in 1982, and now, of course, again, many years later, the FDA approval of sotorasib to actually target that gene was really significant because it is, as you know, you are all the experts, I am just an observer of science, responsible for many cancers and has long been considered an undruggable target. So this is a watershed moment in cancer research, as is the faster approvals of immune checkpoint inhibitors in treating more cancer types, going from 5 cancer types in 2016 to 8 in 2017 and to 18 in 2022. And I just heard just earlier this week from Ken Anderson mentioning that he was giving CAR T cells to multiple myeloma patients. So this is rapidly moving forward after having considered immunology back in 1907. So think about how great it is that you're living in an era of rapidly advancing progress. One of the, of course, challenges is that prevention, we'll talk about later, but there are more than 4 out of 10 cancer cases are associated with obesity, and these are the data, of course, Dr. Sharpless rightfully pointed out that both adults and children are really, we're all getting fat. I have to get on the scale myself. But I do think that we need to focus on that as well as other areas of risk, other risk factors, and also try to get more people screened in the U.S. because right now it's not optimal. The number of cancer cases diagnosed each year is expected to rise because we're getting old, and I had a wonderful conversation with Dr. Sharpless this morning about really having a focus on aging and cancer in the AACR because of the cancer incidence in that population. And of course, as we have heard already, the incidence of certain cancers is rising in the U.S. In certain of these cancers that are noted here. And the racial and ethnic minorities and medically underserved populations are really shouldering a disproportionate burden of cancer. So I laud this cancer center for really focusing on DEI because these challenges we're facing all the time and we need to do better. And I also am so happy that Dr. Ruski has really focused on global issues as well. And I think, from what I understand, you are really wanting to get not only to the local communities, but also across the globe. And we consider the data that are really, that are looming here, 18 million cases in 2020 around the world, potentially 28 million in 2040. Almost 10 million in 2020 cancer deaths, and potentially 16.2 million in 2040. So that's not 25 years from now, Dr. Sharpless, but it's getting pretty close to that, and it's really scary to think that we have to face that. So what is our shared responsibility to drive advances? Well, AACR is the catalyst for advancing, one of the major catalysts, I would say, for the advancing progress for patients. We like to say we prevent and cure all cancers, are trying to, through research, education, communication, and collaborations. And by the way, now we talk about collaborations as if it's new, but this mission statement has been in existence for decades. What we have added was science policy and advocacy and funding for cancer research as areas that we feel are so important, as has been pointed out in the discussion. We are working with a number of sectors, including cancer centers, and I will talk to you a little bit about a recent meeting we had, but also government, industry, scientific societies, philanthropic organizations, and advocacy groups. We are extremely anxious to do better. But I think what is good here is that we're helping individual sectors, but also helping the sectors across each other. What I think is sad is that we haven't gotten to the payers yet. So that's very nascent, and that, as we talk more and more about reimbursement, that is really important. And of course, everything is all about the cancer patient. We are focusing on many scientific priorities for advancing progress, and of course, as an organization that ranges from basic to the clinic, we absolutely have to focus on these. Many of these topics have already been presented today, obviously the novel areas of convergence, and we'll be talking about precision prevention and et cetera. But I think that, as I looked at your profile, it's clear that this cancer center has really developed a major expertise in a lot of these areas already, and we'd love to work more with you on them because obviously we feel that we can really do well together again. Genomics and precision oncology are very important. I was really struck by the recent paper on the role of non-coding on the role of the non-coding genome that was published by Dr. Della Favre in Nature recently. And there are other areas of hematologic malignancies that we really want to focus on because we are anxious to make sure we integrate that into our armamentarium of work, obviously all hoping that we will be able to cover the entire research cycle from bench to bedside and back. We have an impressive list of journals, and thank you very much for sending your papers to our to our journals. Our citation data show that research articles from this institution are highly contributory to the field and are highly cited. And I wanted to mention two new journals. One, of course, is the one I mentioned, which Dr. Della Favre and Ken Anderson are editing. Blood Cancer Discovery, launched in 2020, doing very well and competing very nicely with its mother journal, I guess one could call, in Cancer Discovery, which has an impact factor of 39. Very soon we'll know what the impact factor is, the Blood Cancer Discovery, but we know it's going to be high, so we are very appreciative of his work. And the other journal that has really, has also just been launched is Cancer Research Communications, which is now our first open access journal, because we seem to be forced to do such a journal that will meet the expectations of these laws that are coming out. So we're doing an open access, and that's doing very well too, and we're very lucky to have two scientists, Dr. Martis and Dr. Su, editing that, and all the others. We receive about 10,000 manuscripts a year, which we cheerfully review and edit. We have an annual meeting coming up, and I hope you'll submit your abstracts, and the clinical trials will be available for submission for the January deadline. I wanted to actually mention that Rob Vonderheide and also our president, Lisa Cousins, really decided that this year we would have many more young people present major talks at the meeting. So what is happening now is they are really looking at a whole large list of individuals who have been recommended by cancer center directors around the country, and to add them to the opportunity of giving a major talks, I should say. And so that's a big change, and you'll see that as different, and I think it's going to be very exciting. I know I heard a number of assistant professors speaking this morning, and they were terrific. And so we'll see if we can embellish that and make that even a stronger part of the program. We have multiple working groups, one of which is cancer prevention, and the topics are here. These topics are not all inclusive, but they're the ones that people have complained about. You have to do more in chemistry. You have to do more in radiation science and medicine. We agreed. So we formed a working group, and there are thousands of people who have signed on to these 8 working groups, and other topics are under consideration. And I have to say that they're really making a major difference in fostering the field. There is certainly a laser focus on cancer prevention and early detection interception. This new working group, headed by Adriana Albini from Italy, really will work very hard to incorporate cancer prevention, early detection, and interception, because everybody sees that it's part of the same discussion point. So we will be doing that, and they are having their meetings coming forward, and I think it'll be very interesting. And the Population Sciences group now wants to work with the prevention group, feeling very strongly that their work is also prevention-oriented. So we'll see how that goes. But I did want to mention the DCIS meeting that just took place recently in Philadelphia. This topic I thought was so narrow we probably wouldn't get very many people to come to talk about this pre-cancer. But what was interesting is we received 120 registrants, relatively small as compared with some other conferences, but coming out of that, I heard incredible comments about how people were able to have novel discussions about what could be done in the area of pre-cancers. So I think that it just goes to show you that you really don't have to have big meetings. In fact, smaller ones are probably even better. And we are having a precision prevention meeting coming up in November. That's going to be broader, but I really look forward to having you attend that one and being part of it, that is to say, those who are interested. And then, of course, there will be an innovation summit on the same topic. One of the things we did was to really, of course, launch 2 journals. The one that it's on the right here is the one that I was mentioning was conceptualized by Bernie Weinstein. But we are actually now doing a lot more in the area of prevention, and will continue to do so. We just started 7 years ago to actually do a scientific project. We'd never done that before, and this is a project that Columbia University is involved with, actually, so I wanted to mention that it's doing extremely well. This is the AACR Project Genie, which is an international open source pan-cancer registry of real-world data built through data sharing. And we've heard a lot about the importance of data sharing, about AI being part of interrogating these databases, and it's going very well. And you'll see that we now have 153,000 plus sequenced tumors, and covering 110 major cancer types. And I hope that it is helpful to the institution here. But I just wanted to mention that just this month, in September, Cancer Discovery published a major treatise on the subject. You may want to look at it. I don't know if you're cited in there, but I just noticed this before I left, that we now have, we've just had a new publication on all that's been done in this area over the 7 years. But the important thing I wanted to mention is AACR is all about scientific projects now. So we're going to launch an immuno-oncology portal because of the recommendation of Tony Ribas, whose name was cited this morning as an individual who's been involved in work of one of your scientists. And also we're being told that we should start doing clinical trials, overseeing clinical trials. So I'll keep you posted on all that, but this is all about change within the organization. The important thing to underscore here is that we are very, very concerned about diversity, equity, inclusion, and we've done a lot already in this area, still need to do more, as we all do. Our conference starts tomorrow. Desiree Walker was just telling me she's heading down to Philly tomorrow. I'm heading down to Philly tonight to attend this meeting that's in our hometown. And it's been really a spectacular opportunity to see hundreds of people come in and talk about the science of cancer health disparities. Dr. Sharpless actually presented at this meeting a number of years ago as the NCI director. And also we have other things that are happening in this area. You may know that the Minorities in Cancer Research membership group, which was launched in the year 2000, has thousands of members now. And everybody cares about this area, so let's work harder together. We are, if you would like to participate in the development of the Cancer Disparities Progress Report, Dr. Ruski, we'd love to have a nomination from your cancer center, because this has become a very important publication which legislators are waiting for. And we are about to talk about this on Saturday, talk about the new team that will do the one that will come out in 2024. And of course, there are other areas too that we've talked about, but I did want to mention two new things: the Task Force on Eliminating Racial Inequities in Cancer Research. That's very new, and I don't have anything to report on that yet, except that they wanted to cover the waterfront. And also, Robert A. Wynn Diversity in Clinical Trials Award Program that's being funded very generously by Bristol Myers Squibb to train clinicians to do clinical trial design and also provide guidance on community outreach and engagement. This is a very, very important program. This is 50 minority clinicians trained every year for 5 years. And Bristol Myers Squibb and its foundation and it hopes that this will really help with increasing patient accrual as well, and we're hopeful that that will actually occur. So that's a very nice program. Write me if you have any questions about that. And I did want to, of course, not because I'm a woman, although I will mention that I've benefited from this as well. AACR has had a sustained leadership in fostering the careers of women in the field. And you'll see on the right here, we really in 2018 really did extremely well, the best of all organizations that were tested in showing the representation of women on oncology boards. And you can see Astro, unfortunately, I hate to say this in front of the radiation oncologists in the room, but they didn't do so well, so you better keep your eye on that and bang a tea kettle about that. But suffice it to say that we were that we are ranging about 50% of our leadership women as women. And of course, I also know that many of the earliest women pioneers in cancer research were actually located here in Columbia University, and they've enjoyed leadership opportunities, including Dr. Antman at this cancer center, and of course these great talks. But I did want to mention, that I mentioned that I've been very lucky, and I do consider that. When I was 24 years old, Sidney Winehouse asked me to take over the managing editorship of cancer research. And I was the youngest managing editor in the country. It was because he knew me, I guess, and wanted to take a chance on me. But I was amazed that at that age that I had this opportunity in the AACR to actually, start a career in editing. And of course, that led to my becoming CEO a couple of years ago. But I really do want to say that I was very proud because this was voted on by all the males on our board, and I just feel that AACR is doing extremely well in that regard. Now, in the science policy area, we are really focused. We have in Washington office and a very active science policy officer. And we're doing the things that Dr. Sharpless was mentioning. We are really trying hard to push hard on advocating for sustained funding, federal funding. And we are actually, we did something a number of years ago in 2013. We started something called the Rally for Medical Research, which just took place yesterday and the night before, to really push hard for all of funding for all of medical research. Francis Collins was there speaking, as was Senator Durbin and a number of other people. And it's clear that this has become a very special thing that we have led, and I'm very proud of that. We also collaborate with FDA, and we're going to do what we can to try to keep that accelerated approval going, Dr. Sharpless, and build alliances with cancer survivors and patient advocacy groups. So we'll be really announcing our progress report, our 12th progress report on the 21st, at the same day as we are having our 115th anniversary, and it'll be exciting to be able to express all these things to the legislators and their assistants about what all of you are doing in this field. Now, of course, as I said, and has been said, research funding is absolutely pivotal, and we are working as hard as we can to make sure that we support increased funding for NCI. I remember in 1997, Phil Sharp headed a research task force, and he and his group said we needed $15 billion a year at that time in '97 to be able to fund cancer research because of the cost of trials, because of the cost of just about everything that you do. And of course now we're at $6.9 billion, and we hope to get to the level that was mentioned by Dr. Sharpless. But I think that it's clear that we have to work harder, and especially if we're going to get to this 15th percentile by 2025, which has just been announced as a goal by Doug Lowy. We will be monitoring the funding for the NCI Moonshot and ARPA-H. Many of you know that there's a concern that people think the ARPA-H money is going to be taken away from NCI funding. We don't know yet whether that is, but the important thing is both of them have to be funded well for us to do well in this area. But I also wanted to underscore the funding provided by nonprofit organizations and philanthropic organizations. We have relied very much on industry to fund grants. Industry really needs to step up to the plate even more so, because research, important research, even basic research that was mentioned as really needing to be funded generously, should be funded by industry, and I hope that that will be an item that we can really talk to the industry roundtable when we meet on October 21st about, and let them know how important it is to really help us fund innovative, high-risk, high-reward projects that may not receive federal funding, early career work, and of course, team science that is very expensive. And we know how hard we have to work. We are trying to increase the amount of our focus on fundraising from the AACR. and I think we will do so going forward with the help of our Chief Philanthropic Officer, Mitch Stoller, who's here today. So I think that we'll work as hard as we can to bring in more money to give out to the best research that's around. Now, when I spoke to Desiree a few minutes ago, I was, I mentioned to her that I was going to just highlight the Science of Survivor program that was started in 1999. I'm so happy that two cancer survivors and patient advocates are here today to participate, because we desperately need cancer patient advocates to really discuss and bring their voice to the issue. We have a number of them working on our educational workshops that are just fantastic, and I'm really hopeful that all of our programs that have been conceptualized there, actually, which are funded by industry to a certain extent, will really be helpful in the long run to be able to bring the patient voice to where we go. I mentioned Cancer Center directors because we just had an amazing meeting on July 20 to 22, where we brought actually in person over 60 Cancer Center directors to Philadelphia to talk for a couple of days about how we can all work together and collaborate. We want to work together to make advances in basic and translational research, and these were just some of the things that came out of this meeting. What is clear to me is that this group wants to stay together with us, which surprised me actually a little bit, but they want to engage together as one voice. They even called themselves the nation's network of cancer centers. And I, they said N2C2. I said, what's N2C2? I thought it was name of a robot or something like that. But anyway, it was fun to hear their suggestions for how we can do better. This slide covers all of those opportunities. Of course, funding is on their mind, but everything else, including collaborations across cancer centers to do industry sponsored projects, and so we took a word cloud, and you'll see that the center was collaboration and funding and workforce and opportunity and impact. Those were the words that really came out to be most prominent in the word cloud. And the picture shows our officers were there. This is Lisa Cousins, the president of AACR, President-elect Phil Greenberg, immediate past president Dave Tuvison, and all the Cancer Center directors. So I was looking to try to find Dr. Ruski in this picture, and I couldn't find him. And I said, what, was he in the men's room during this important photograph? And then I found him, in the back. He was blocked by a would-be competitor, okay? So you were there, you weren't in the men's room, you were there with us. So thank you very much for your contributions. So winding down, I had just a couple more slides I wanted to show you. First of all, I think that I wanted to mention that obviously our current opportunities for innovation in cancer research are extraordinary. We've already heard a lot about the new wave of technology shaping the future of precision medicine and all the amazing stuff that's going on. And I know that you're involved in theragnostics and flash here, radiomics. But what is fascinating to me is that there's no end to what can be done in the big data and AI area. We need to do more. I just got an email this morning from a colleague in Europe who oversees the liquid biopsies consortium there of all the European institutions, and he told me he just got millions of dollars for this project that he's doing in this space. So obviously there's a lot that can be done here with money, and we know that no money, no mission, so we don't want to keep on whining about that, but obviously we have to work because technologies are expensive, but it's clear that this institution is doing extremely well in the new technology area, which is at the centerpiece of everything we can do. And of course, new approaches to immunotherapy, very important, cancer vaccines. The microbiome wasn't mentioned this morning, but I understand that one of your colleagues are working in the microbiome area, and of course the the chief is a GI guy, so we have to make sure that that gets covered. And the Pre-Cancer Atlas, which is being worked on in several venues, as well as HTAN, will generate knowledge in the pre-cancer space, and I hope that there'll be some discussion about that in a little while. And we did learn a lot, Lisa, from the changes that we just had as a result of COVID, for the new telehealth approaches to patient care, and I think that will help a great deal. And of course, we are in the age of combination therapy, and I almost wanted to put the sixth pillar in there because it is, combination therapy is becoming very important, and people do feel that that's the sixth pillar. So that's what's happening now. But so we have to ask ourselves, what can we do going forward to really advance innovation? And so this is what AACR is thinking about. Increase our focus on cancer prevention, early detection, interception. We've already said that, and I think that an interesting area is combining population science, which is very strong here at this institution, with laboratory research. We also need to advance a more efficient and patient-centered and inclusive cancer research, a clinical research enterprise, including all stakeholders. And I think that's in part what the cancer center directors were talking about. And by the way, the report from that meeting was 11 pages, single space. It was extraordinary what they want to accomplish. And so we will work hard to respond to those things. We need to prioritize cross-disciplinary and cross-institutional team science. Again, it's going to take money. It's very impressive what was worked out with NCI and Cancer Research UK with the Cancer Grand Challenges. I just had dinner with the guy who's directing that from the UK, and I think it's very impressive, Dr. Sharpless. I think it's going to be very, very important going forward. And they're asking us to get involved in that, so we'll see how that goes. Improve patient outcomes by increasing data sharing. We've talked a lot about today. Equitable patient care. Obviously, patient navigation is going to become very, very important. I heard recently that from Rob Wynn, who's one of the Cancer Center directors, that he's really focusing a great deal on community outreach and patient navigation as an important way to bring in more people into clinical trials. Digital health technologies, of course, wearables, that kind of thing, and diversity in the workforce. Obviously, we need to strengthen the workforce. Our president, Lisa Cousins, wants to really work on the STEM pipeline. She's developing her thoughts about this and wants to bring in more young people into the field, and I applaud her for that, and we'll be working on that as well. And partnership with industry, not just pharma, but also beyond traditional biopharma, including these very rich companies that are getting our money every day, like Amazon. Okay. And finally, conceptualize and incentivize synergistic collaborations across the cancer centers. I think I learned a lot from that meeting, and I can't, I can only tell you that it was an extremely exciting 2 days. So more will come out of that as well. So obviously we have an enormous responsibility to drive advances against this field and work together, establish our collective voice, and do all these things that I've already talked about. I think what is clear is that we really can't wait 38 more years for a basic science a concept to be brought into the clinic. And it is happening faster, but we need to be even faster. In order to do that, we need to work together and implement novel mechanisms that accelerate progress against cancer. I think that we have a lot of fabulous minds in the AACR. Our staff likes to call it the greatest minds in the field, and I think that's true. But we need to also bring them together. I think today we heard about integration. Integrative cancer research is going to be very important. And we need to think out of the box and have a little bit, and do that regularly rather than just decide that we are, that what we're doing is okay. So we'll move out of our comfort zone and put money into things that are perhaps not yet solid, but certainly that's the way to make discoveries. This is what industry does all the time. They always think ahead. And in our case, we have to think ahead. So I think we should behave like Wayne Gretzky and skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been, and make more progress as fast as we can for patients. We all have these patients in our families. I have a young cousin who's 63 years old and is in very bad shape from pancreatic cancer. Her father died of pancreatic cancer. It's very sad to realize that in today's world we still are facing these diseases that are so difficult to deal with. So I wish you the very best. I really hope that our commitment, our respective commitments, will be successful going forward, and we'll be able to really dramatically decrease incidence, mortality, and morbidity for all cancers along the lines of what our President Biden is really pushing for, and maybe even earlier than 25 years from now. I'd like to see a little more in my own lifetime. So I look forward to our future collaborations with you, and I want to thank you for the honor of speaking today and for your very kind attention. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Foti. And if there's a new category of the most influential people in cancer research, cancer care, cancer advocacy, would you not agree it'd be Dr. Sharpless and Dr. Foti as they've been leading us? So I'm going to call upon esteemed colleague, Dr. Mary Beth Terry. She's professor of epidemiology and leads our collective efforts in cancer community outreach and engagement, and it underscores the synergy and interrelationships between our 4 health professional schools on campus. Mary Beth?
Thank you very much. It's my privilege to introduce the next set of speakers. And on behalf of our population science program at the HICCC, which spans all of the different schools on campus and is rooted in a public health mission to take all of our discoveries directly into public health practice in our local communities. So as you already heard, we have grounded, thanks to Dr. Weinstein many years ago, molecular epidemiology. We've had that tradition continue through the leadership of Dr. Santella and many others. And we have, within our population science program, really distinguishing features that are really important for this very moment of time, which is addressing the major health inequities that exist around the country, especially in New York City, which is the burden of cancer in young adults, which is increasing very rapidly. And we have very many interdisciplinary approaches within our memberships to do that. Today, you'll hear from the chair of environmental science, and we have a long tradition, thanks to Dr. Weinstein and molecular epidemiology, of rooting many of our community-based research projects in environmental carcinogenesis. Our community members, like Desiree Walker and others on our advisory boards, always push us to look beyond individual level risk factors, to look at household, community level environmental carcinogens, how the social environment gets under our skin. You'll hear from Dr. Llanos about that in just a minute. We also have a rich tradition in following multi-generational family cohorts for over 2.5 decades. These cohorts are not only critical for gene discovery, they've been essential to show that everything is an integration between the genes and the environment. And related to that, we have multiple family-based cohorts that we followed that specifically look at windows of susceptibility. And all of that work has taught us and showed us that cancer prevention is the wrong way to approach this. It's cancer risk reduction, that the individuals themselves are within families, within communities, within environments, and so we can reduce our risk of cancer, but let's really be transparent very much that that's at a population level, that we can think about the risk reduction. And when we need to use all of our
groundbreaking discoveries in improving the way that we identify these higher risk cohorts. So I'd like to really thank the speakers in the next section because all of the work that they do is directly relevant, and we have a huge team of community health workers, some of whom are here today, and I'd like to just take a very brief moment for all of us to thank them because they're in our community every day. So if you guys could just stand up for a minute. Come on, stand up. Stand up. And they are in particular focused on now peer-to-peer education programs that we do within the community, and we start these programs in local middle schools and high schools, which is where we need to address the major disparities that are occurring, particularly in early onset cancers here in New York City. We serve a diverse catchment area, of which 2/3 are individuals of color. We have over 40% of our local catchment area that are foreign-born, so our discoveries that we put into practice here are local and global. And we also have a large population of individuals that are extremely impoverished. And so our programs of outreach that they lead have been really groundbreaking, and we have some of the highest rates of human papillomavirus vaccination as well as screening, thanks to all of the work that they do. So without any further ado, I'd like to thank our panelists and introduce our first speaker, Dr. Castrinos.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak. So cancer risk reduction has often relied on the patient to do the right thing, perhaps having a good healthcare provider to guide them in doing the right thing, maintaining a healthy lifestyle, exercising, avoiding certain bad habits and lifestyles, maybe taking an aspirin for chemoprevention. But the focus also is on the participation in screening programs. Let's say colonoscopy for the prevention of colon cancer, where a precursor lesion could be identified and removed before cancer developed, or taking up mammography for the early detection of breast cancer should it develop. Doing what we can to stay ahead of cancer or detecting cancer early in order to have the best outcomes. But we all know that patients develop cancer even if they've done everything right. And their outcomes may not be always so favorable. We know that the cancer biology can remain elusive, but we still have the patients that present, the new mother, the 30-year-old with breast cancer, or you heard about the young actor in his 40s with advanced colon cancer who wasn't even eligible for colorectal cancer screening. How about the patient that presents with their third or fourth cancer, or families where it seems that everybody had cancer? Who are these patients? Why so young? Why so many cancers? Why such a heavy burden of cancer in families? These patients are the patients we see at the Cancer Center and our high-risk and prevention clinics. They present to not only ask the why, but also how. How are we going to improve their survivorship? And it affords us the opportunity to provide collaborative, multidisciplinary care to those individuals, to offer them really novel and strategic approaches to how to optimize their survival. We take the opportunity to look at genetics in their tumors, but also to assess for inherited susceptibility and whether there's a faulty gene, a pathogenic variant that might explain their cancers, because that too can impact their treatment and outcomes. Importantly, that information also trickles down to family members, those individuals, many of whom don't have cancer, but are considered now at higher risk and are motivated to take measures to prevent cancer. So the role and application of genetic testing has come a long way, but its application and rather its implementation at populations at large still needs some work. I want to just make a point that when I refer to genetic testing, I'm referring to germline genetic testing. So when a pathogenic variant exists, a faulty gene that is passed on from one generation to the next. Many of you probably know BRCA and hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, a very well-recognized inherited cancer syndrome. Angelina Jolie publicized it many years ago. The uptake of germline genetic testing skyrocketed after she announced and shared her journey with her mother's case of ovarian cancer and being identified as a BRCA1 carrier. She's an example of a previvor, an individual known to carry an increased risk of cancer due to a pathogenic variant in a cancer susceptibility gene. A previvor has the ability to use that information to take on cancer risk-reducing efforts, whether it's intensive screening and surveillance or risk-reducing surgeries, to participate in trials related to chemoprevention. So where were we 50 years ago with respect to genetic risk assessment? We actually did have a biomarker 50 years ago. It was free. It actually really required a physician's time and curiosity. It's the family history. And this is very simple, a very simple slide that really shows an experience that a family can have. And this is really powerful because the patients who present with a family history, some of them who present unaffected, are really motivated to do more, are motivated and engaged to know what's out there, to do the right thing. So 50 years ago, we would look at a family like this. Someone would present often with a young onset of cancer, and we would see that the family was riddled with multiple malignancies. And for the next 25 years, we developed family cancer registries and built biorepositories. And over time, we were able to define clinical criteria that defined families by cancer types and cancer spectrums. We were also able, based on this simple family tree, to develop screening guidelines to advise patients how they needed to then prevent additional cancers, or in family members who weren't unaffected by cancer, what they needed to do to reduce their risk. And 25 or so years later, in the mid-1990s, gene discoveries were made. BRCA was discovered, and cancer risk in certain families like this was better defined. And that information really trickles down also to individuals and family members and to our previvors who have a great opportunity to reduce their risk of cancer. So I want to use an example of an inherited cancer syndrome near and dear to my heart, Lynch syndrome. I'm a gastroenterologist, and Lynch syndrome is the most common inherited colon cancer syndrome. Lynch syndrome is associated with a 10 to 60% increased risk of colorectal cancer. The general population average risk for developing colon cancer is 6%. Someone who's at average risk for colon cancer probably needs somewhere like 3 colonoscopies in their lifetime for the ability and the possibility of preventing colon cancer. A patient with Lynch syndrome starts screening at age 25 and undergoes intensive surveillance with colonoscopy every 1 to 2 years. That's about 30 to 50 colonoscopies in their lifetime. These patients are ideal to consider novel strategies of cancer screening, liquid biopsies, and are actually a wonderful cohort to explore the performance of some of these new tools and technologies in high risk. Lynch syndrome also causes a number of extracolonic cancers. Women are at increased risk for endometrial cancer and ovarian cancer. When they're done with childbearing, often before they hit menopause, the recommendation is to undergo total abdominal hysterectomy and bilateral oophorectomy. So to prevent cancer in these patients takes a large commitment. Now, I want to go back and really talk to you about the history of Lynch syndrome because we've made great advances. Lynch syndrome was described close to 100 years ago, actually a little over 100 years ago, by Dr. Warthen. He was a pathologist at the University of Michigan. He had time and was curious. He had nothing to do with cancer pathology at the time. He was curious because his seamstress would come in distraught every so often. Multiple family members, multiple siblings were affected with cancer, different types of cancers across multiple generations, many succumbing to cancer at a young age. And Dr. Warthen first described her family, known as Family G, which would be followed for many years later. This is the original pedigree by Dr. Warthen. In 1960, Henry Lynch continued to follow Family G. He also accumulated many other families in which multiple cancers presented. Colon cancer, hereditary colon cancer, and Lynch syndrome is named after Henry Lynch, shown here. He was bold in the 1960s to make a claim that cancer could be inherited. Having met Henry Lynch and having heard him speak, he said he was looked at as a quack at that time. Nobody thought that cancer could be inherited. It was all environmental. But he persisted, and his families later on were used to make groundbreaking discoveries in Lynch syndrome and the mismatch repair genes that are associated with Lynch syndrome. So family history defined Lynch syndrome in the 60s and later on. It was not until the 80s when we had a new biomarker for Lynch syndrome, and that was the tumor. Colon cancer tumors have a special feature and a hallmark feature, and that's microsatellite instability. About 95% of all Lynch syndrome cancers exhibit microsatellite instability because Lynch syndrome is caused by mismatch repair deficiency. So microsatellite instability is pretty important these days because of immunotherapy. In fact, many cancers now are screened for microsatellite instability, not to identify Lynch syndrome, but to target treatment and for the use of immunotherapy. With that, we've been really discovering more and more cases of Lynch syndrome, kind of through the back door. The tumors of these cancers show microsatellite instability, and all thereafter go on to germline testing, where we have the opportunity to identify this high-risk condition. So Lynch syndrome is not uncommon. 1 in 300 individuals has Lynch syndrome. That's the same prevalence as BRCA-associated hereditary breast and ovarian cancer. However, the difference is that a lot of individuals with Lynch syndrome don't know they have it. In fact, it's estimated that over 1 million Americans have Lynch syndrome, but just don't know it. So our focus now and the opportunity that we have is to move away from the cancer patient and to actually focus on the previvors, to focus on the family members, those who are at risk based on knowing the pathogenic variant in their relative with cancer. So how could we do this? A simple way is to go back to the family tree, the simple pedigree. And if you identify, shown here, the cancer patient, the female with cancer tested and found to carry a pathogenic variant, the implications of that finding are great. Because all these relatives have a risk. These at-risk relatives are then eligible for genetic testing. Predictive genetic testing can inform them as to whether or not they carry the disease, and then afterwards to improve any risk-reducing strategies. I just want to point out that the impact is tremendous when you identify one mutation carrier. It trickles down to other generations. And of course, every pedigree has a face to it. Our lovely patient here has Lynch syndrome. She has 5 children shown in the back with their spouses. Genetic testing can identify who benefits from screening and also can classify those who don't have Lynch and can then go on to general population recommendations of screening. And then we have a younger generation who could also benefit from that information. I wish I could say that this kind of approach, where we take our proband with the germline mutation and extend genetic testing, could yield 100% identification for these conditions. This approach of cascade testing to capture every relative doesn't work so well. At best, we can capture near 40% of family members who are at risk. So we have to get creative. A lot of our research has focused on creating risk assessment tools based on family history that provide calculated risk scores, tools that can be incorporated into the electronic medical record, where family history can be plugged in to get a risk score of when a patient should undergo genetic testing. But we have to think beyond that as well. And one approach that we may be seeing, and I don't think we'll need to wait 50 years, is to actually consider predictive genetic testing in the general population, in health. So to consider having a 25-year-old or 30-year-old who comes in for a well visit, where they're screened for hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, diabetes, and possibly inherited cancer susceptibility. I don't think we're that far off. In fact, the Office of Public Health Genomics of the CDC has classified 3 conditions as Tier 1 conditions for which population-based genetic testing is appropriate. 2 of those 3 conditions are related to inherited cancer. 1 is Lynch syndrome, 2 is BRCA, the 3rd is familial hypercholesterolemia. So I think we will be seeing in the near future the discussions of when to consider germline testing in the general population. I think one added benefit, and a very important benefit, of providing population-based germline testing is that it will provide equitable care. Social determinants and inherent biases have held back many advancements for underrepresented populations. Clinical cancer genetics is no different. And I actually think it might have a bigger gap because the technology has moved so fast where our clinical interpretation of data has not only lagged, but is unclear in underrepresented populations who haven't participated in research, who have barely undergone enough genetic testing to know what results mean. To give you an example, the uptake of genetic testing in a US commercial laboratory, if you look at the demographics of who undergoes testing, 85% of individuals self-report as white from European backgrounds. In that 85% group, it's a near split of patients with cancer and those without. So the message has resonated for certain populations that genetic testing can be used in health without cancer, and to use that information to guide screening strategies, to guide preventive risk-reducing strategies. The 15% who do not identify as white of European descent, the majority of those individuals have cancer. The majority of those individuals have early onset cancer. So the approach to those patients is the approach we've had many, many years ago. What that points out is that very few individuals who are Black, Asian, Latino are getting genetic testing in health based on the family history, based on their knowledge and know-how that important information could help guide their screening and prevention. So I want to finish up with something that I find tremendously exciting. A trial is opening up for Lynch syndrome pre-fivers. It will be recruiting patients for a vaccine trial. Lynch syndrome is a unique condition in that its mutations are predictable and they yield a distinct set of neoantigens that can be targeted. So this trial is opening up for pre-vivers with the hopes of a real tool of immunoprevention. So it feels like we've come full circle in Lynch syndrome, in taking care and optimizing the care of patients with immunotherapy, but also with the potential of using immunopreventive approaches and vaccines. I don't think we'll need to wait 50 years, and I'm excited for that. So in conclusion, we're here at Columbia to optimize the care of all our cancer patients and with the hopes of keeping our pre-vivers cancer-free. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a great talk and a great starting point for me to pick up and continue the presentation today. Because we heard about the genetic code, and my role today is to tell you about a different code, which is the zip code. We worry a lot about genetics and genetic code, but if we look at what determines health, what is the strongest determinant of health in our life, the zip code comes out on top. For instance, just here in New York City, Manhattan, you might walk across the Upper East Side, and if you're born there today, your life expectancy is going to be 85 years of life. If you're born in central Harlem, you're just a few steps away, your life expectancy is going to be 75. We are neighbors, but we don't share the same health. And this is even more dramatic for cancer. And what I want to tell you today is that, of course, the environment in where we live is very important. And up to 90% of cancer is attributable to environmental causes. The good news is that some of these causes, at least, can be removed. There are some that are much more structural, and we're going to hear about those, and hopefully we can remove also those over time. But some are easier to identify. And the one we are working on in my lab are chemicals. So why do we care about chemicals? We care about chemicals because we live in a world that is filled with chemicals. I'll give you some numbers, don't get scared. There are about 3,000 new chemicals that are brought to the market in the United States every year. In total, old and current chemicals, we produce or import about 9.5 trillion pounds of chemicals every year in the United States, which if we divide those by 300 million of us and some, it's about every year 30,000 pounds of chemicals that are introduced in the United States in our environment, which is mind-blowing. So what we are doing in my lab is to try to do something about this. We have a lot of technologies, very sophisticated and advanced, for diagnosing cancer. How about diagnosing chemicals? So imagine that we could fingerprint chemicals, and not just chemicals, everything around us, everything around the environment, whether it's social stressors, whether it's diet, whether it's physical activity, and chemicals that impacts our health and brings about cancer. So if we can do that with a drop of blood, whether we have a way to fingerprint each of these stressors, each of these risk factors that cause cancer. And there are ways to do this. This is a great challenge, but there are ways to do this. And the way we do it in my lab is by using epigenetics. So let me take here a pause and give my signature example explaining epigenetics, which some of you certainly have already heard. And in my example, this music score on the left is the DNA. And of course, the music score is a code that is going to give you a phenotype, is going to give you the performance you're going to enjoy. Just walk down, take the metro to Lincoln Center tomorrow and tonight, you'll have great options down there. But think about bringing me on the podium and be the director, or play the violin, or play the piano. You don't know me musically, but I can guarantee that will go very bad. It's going to be, and many of you probably who try to play instruments or do play instruments may relate to that. So this tells you, of course, something that we know all in cancer research, that there is a variation of how the genomic risk factors penetrate and how much they can bring to cause cancer. But here you haven't seen the epigenome yet. Epigenetics is not in the picture yet, because to take a look at the epigenome, you need to walk on stage, be allowed to look over the shoulders of each of the performers, and at that point you will see something more. You will see something added onto the music score, something added onto the DNA that does not change the DNA sequence, but does change how the music score is expressed, it is performed. And this is what happens with epigenetics. Epigenetics are chemical modifications of the DNA that do not change the sequence remains the same, but it determines very strongly whether the genes are on and off. And particularly, we have been working, and also want to add that these markings can be a different type. It can be marks that are in ink. Once they're applied, they're forever. Something might happen when we are young, an history of stress or abuse. Our genes get rewired. DNA methylation changes forever. Stress genes are hyperactive all of our life, unfortunately. Or something might happen today that is much more subtle, or something that's different in nature, and our genes are rewired differently. So I love to say that these markings can be in ink and in pencil. And perhaps we should say hard pencil and soft pencil with different capacity to erase them. And, but let me get out of the analogy and let you go to what we actually study, which is DNA methylation. It's the most commonly studied of the epigenetic marks. It's a chemical modification of cytosine bases that get methylated. The sequence remains the same, but when a gene is methylated, usually it's inactive, it's off. And this happens all the time in our life. It's an amazing system through which our bodies adapt to the environment and react to the environment. And this is the way our cells can really adapt to different environments. With climate change looming, this is one of the ways we hope we will survive. And of course, this is very important, but the way we access this in my lab is thinking that this becomes almost like a hard drive, with everything that impacts our body from outside gets written down. So the question is that if we have this hard drive with all this marking that tells us about exposure to air pollution, to chemicals, food, whether we're active or not, social stressor, can we access it and can we read it? And the answer, of course, is yes. We can potentially, we are working to develop simple tests in blood, saliva, or anything else, where we can read this hard drive. And today we can see whether people have smoked. We can tell whether someone is a smoker or not. And of course, more important, whether they smoked in the past, how long, how many years, how many cigarettes. There are algorithms to use DNA methylation and do that. And this is because DNA methylation reacts to all of these stressors. So here is what I think we could do. And I'm giving you a preview of the future, so be careful, take this with care. The future is unknown, and I don't have a magic sphere with me. But let's think about going to your doctor 10 years from now or 20 years from now. You will be bothered about your cholesterol. They will tell you you have to cut back on Italian cakes, which I love very much. He will tell you that to walk more. But in addition to getting your cholesterol, your sugar tested, your doctor will be able to tell you about your methylation profiling. They will tell you things that are incredible today. They will, using blood, they will tell you that you have been exposed to air pollution, or perhaps that you are doing very well instead with tobacco, or that there are harmful metals in water that bother you, and your body is reacting, your genes are getting activated or inactivated by this. So you can see, for instance, you would have this commentary to your test saying you are in great shape, you have a healthy diet and great for your active lifestyle, but you know, we need to worry about the metals in your water and the air pollution you live in. Let's talk, we can find ways to help you. And so my dream is that a dream where we can create precision medicine approaches to help solve part of the issue, help change our behavior, motivate our behavior, and especially fight cancer when it is easiest to fight it, which is before it happens. This is all I had, and thank you so much.
I just want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak today at such a fantastic celebration. Celebrating 50 years of the Herbert Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center and thinking about the next 50 years. So to start, I want to just take a look at a few headlines that have been in recent media. You've probably seen many of these, if not all of them. And one of the things that they each depict is that racial inequities exist in maternal mortality and in breast cancer. And these have been the topic of discussion for many years. These headlines might suggest that Black women or women racialized as Black have poorer health outcomes, specifically related to maternal outcomes and breast cancer, or maybe that they have poorer health outcomes in general. But is that true? Is race a risk factor for poor health outcomes? The simple answer is no. What each of these reports and the underlying research tell us is that racial inequities exist in such a way that women racialized as Black experience poor health outcomes. What these headlines and what these reports cannot tell us is the reasons that these inequities exist. You'll hear me throughout the talk use the term inequity, disparity, and I want to distinguish between the two. So a disparity is a measure of difference between two groups, while an inequity suggests that the difference exists because of some injustice. So it's more actionable. In other words, the only way to correct an inequity is through action. So getting back to the headlines, none of these tell us why these disparities or inequities exist in the first place. So race as we know it and the way it's most often operationalized in research has no biological basis. There is no, it isn't a causal factor for any health outcome. Race is socially constructed, but it is a surrogate for other social determinants of health, and these social determinants of health are highly predictive of our lived experiences. So we heard in Dr. Baccarelli's talk that where we live, where we work, where we play, where we pray, our zip code is much more predictive of our outcomes. So rather than focusing on the impact of race or the contribution of race in cancer research, we should really be considering the impact of place. For example, how might where we live affect the cells in our bodies? Or how might where we live, how does our zip code affect biomarkers in our blood, in our tissues, in the tumor microenvironment among individuals diagnosed with cancer? These are some of the questions that can be answered, and I would say these are the types of questions that we should be trying to answer. In my research, in some of my collaborative research where I collaborate with social and spatial epidemiologists, we have found that certain neighborhood factors significantly correlate with the risk of poorer breast cancer outcomes. So I put this image up to give you an example. How would you describe the photo on the left versus the photo on the right? Can you imagine what living in a neighborhood like the one on the left might be like, or the one on the right? On the left, you can see some of the effects of neighborhood disinvestment. You can see things like graffiti, debris, boarded windows. You see things like crumbling sidewalks and abandoned buildings. But on the right, you can see that this neighborhood is well kept. There's walkable sidewalks, green space. Other things that you might deduce from this picture is that residents in the neighborhood on the right might have access to grocery stores in walking distance, or maybe they have access to organic foods, more so than residents in neighborhoods like the one on the left. So using data from the New Jersey State Cancer Registry, we actually found that increasing physical disorder in neighborhoods is actually associated, well, actually these are measures of neighborhood disinvestment, but increasing physical disorder is significantly associated with shorter breast cancer survival. Probably not surprising was that our data showed that Black and Hispanic women resided in neighborhoods that looked like the one on the left 69% of the time. So these neighborhoods, these zip codes, represent areas that have the highest levels of neighborhood disinvestment. And increasing neighborhood disinvestment is associated with underinsurance, late-stage diagnosis of cancer, higher-grade tumors, and with triple-negative breast cancer risk. So the most aggressive form of breast cancer. Areas with these high levels of observable neighborhood disinvestment are also the communities that have lower socioeconomic composition. They have less primary care physicians per person, greater residential racial segregation, and overall higher population density. So again, thinking about place rather than race is what really will help us predict health outcomes. So we also found that neighborhood redlining is associated with inequities in breast cancer. By redlining, I mean the government-sponsored practice of denying individuals access to mortgages based on the location of properties and homes in minority and socioeconomically disadvantaged neighborhoods. So in terms of the likelihood of qualifying for a mortgage approval, areas coded as red in this map were considered hazardous or risky, and those that are in yellow were also risky, but a little less so than the red areas, and the blue and the green areas were the desirable areas for mortgages. Through the system of redlining, Black Americans were prevented from purchasing homes in areas that were blue or green, and therefore they were relegated to residing in areas that are red. As I mentioned, those areas are also the areas that looked like the photo that was on the left. The most interesting thing about our findings was that present-day redlining, residents in an area that was historically redlined to living there now was associated with, actually I need to rephrase. So the study found that present-day residents in areas that were not redlined, so these were the blue and the green areas, were actually associated with better breast cancer outcomes. So women that resided in those areas had lower odds of late-stage diagnosis, lower odds of high-grade tumors, and lower odds of triple-negative breast cancer subtype, and they also had lower hazards of breast cancer-specific mortality. So thinking about what I just said, so residents in areas that were not redlined were associated with better outcomes, right? The unfortunate thing was that Black and Hispanic women who also resided in these not redlined areas did not have those positive benefits. So another way to interpret that is that the potential intergenerational impacts of living in a historically redlined area, and redlining is not legal today, but it still has a potential impact on health today. So another point is about the historical and persistent underrepresentation of Black and Hispanic individuals and other marginalized groups, rural residents, LGBTQ populations. We can think of other vulnerable populations that have also been underrepresented in genomics research and cancer genomics research. Most genomics data have been generated from populations of largely European ancestry. And because of this, we know a lot about the genetic mutations that are linked to cancer in these groups, and we know much less about their impacts among Black women with breast cancer, for instance. For example, we heard in Dr. Castrinos's talk about the BRCA1 and 2 genes. The mutations and their relationships with cancer risk was really discovered and really characterized in the early 90s in a population of Ashkenazi Jewish women of European ancestry. It took over 20 years for new data to emerge connecting those same mutations in BRCA1 and 2 with cancer risk in Black women. The other thing that we know from emerging data is that Black women have a higher prevalence of variants of unknown significance in these well-characterized genes. Something else we know is that breast cancer and cancers in general are not just due to mutations in one gene. So multiple genes and multiple hotspots across the genome have been linked to cancer susceptibility. And through the combination of genetic markers, clinical history, and family history, polygenic risk scores can be used to assess an individual's true cancer risk. But unfortunately, in breast cancer, the assessment of risk using these models and these risk scores do not function the same way for Black and Hispanic women. So they're not as accurate and they're not as useful as they are for women of European ancestry. So similar to what Dr. Castrinos mentioned, we really need to make sure that cancer risk models are useful for all populations so that there can be equity in outcomes and also in prevention. So underrepresentation of diverse study participants in clinical trials is also problematic and has been. It's widely documented that breast cancer clinical trials continue to suffer from a lack of representation of the US population and global populations. A recent review documented that while Black individuals accounted for 12% of all breast cancer cases in 2020, they accounted for only 3% of the clinical trial participants for FDA-approved breast cancer drugs. Policies have been put in place to increase the representation of women in clinical trials, but we need policies that also increase the representation of other sociodemographic groups so that we can ensure that all of our clinical trials that will lead to the development of novel therapeutics, devices, and technologies will have an impact on all of the populations that will benefit. And so they need to be included in the initial testing. An excellent example of this comes from the Columbia-Pfizer partnership, which is focusing on increasing diversity not just in participants, but also across clinical trialists, so the investigators running these trials. And this initiative will also enhance access to high-quality health care for traditionally underrepresented and underserved groups. So the past has shown us that persistent inequities in breast cancer, including the incidence of more aggressive disease at younger ages, poorer survival, and greater mortality among Black women are attributable to a combination of social determinants of health, not just race. In the next 50 years, and thinking about how we advance our efforts to address cancer mortality and really move the needle to address health inequities, we need to think about addressing these inequities across the cancer continuum. So by including diverse, inclusive populations in the research that really understands the biology of cancers and etiology of cancers, that would lead us to precision prevention so that we can promote and identify novel ways to prevent cancer in our populations, not just in the US, but globally, and more importantly, in the communities that we're situated in. I'll also add that a greater push, and we've talked about this, or we've heard a lot about this afternoon, but interdisciplinary research where there are investigators from multiple different areas of expertise will also be important, and thinking about the intersection of social determinants of health and biology. So this is how we'll uncover the sociobiologic mechanisms of cancer and how we'll understand and address cancer inequities moving forward. I just want to put this slide up here because all of the things that we've been considering, all of the risk factors and mechanisms, they all act at multiple intersecting levels of influence. And so thinking about all of these levels of influence, a major thing that we have to consider is making sure that we involve our community partners and really involving the community in the research questions that we're asking and how we can help them achieve health equity. So with that, I want to end my talk with 3 words: racism, not race. Racism is not a risk factor for poor health. I'm sorry, racism is a risk factor for poor health. Race is not a risk factor for poor health. And only through the actions taken that will combat or target racism will we ever move towards health equity. Thank you.
Just riveting, awesome talks again. Round of applause for all the speakers. A few more things left, if you'll bear with us. We're really honored to have Carmen De La Rosa give a few remarks. From 2017 to 2021, she represented the 72nd District in the New York State Assembly. And since January of 2022, this calendar year, she represents District 10 on the New York City Council. And she's really been an advocate for so many for so long. So thank you for giving some remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Councilmember Carmen De La Rosa, and it's an honor to be here. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. From what I heard, I got the tail end of that last speaker. It's been a very fascinating day of a lot of information. I want to thank Columbia University. I want to thank the Cancer Center, the Institute, as well as New York Presbyterian for being partners for our community. I grew up in Washington Heights. I grew up in this community that I now get the privilege and honor of representing every day at the New York City Council, and before that in the New York State Legislature. And what I can tell you is that we are a community of resilient, proud, happy, hardworking people. But we're also a community that has, yeah, clap for that, yes. But we're also a community that has overcome immense challenges, systemic inequities. Dating back, I mean, I grew up in this community in the 90s, from when you remember, you know, the days of the Washington Heights of the 90s, right? We've overcome so much. We're now a much safer, much more conscious community. It's taken a lot of work to get to where we are today. And I know that a lot of this work is embedded in institutions like Columbia University and New York Presbyterian, premier institutions in our community. When I think about the partnerships of where our communities is going, I know that it is because of the work of institutions like these that we have our brightest days yet to come. I want to say that I know that cancer is something that our community deals with. Many of us, all of us, have been touched by folks who unfortunately have succumbed to cancer. We know that the risk factors that contribute to cancer are very prevalent in our communities. Just this morning, I was touring a school that is right next to the Cross Bronx Expressway. And we know that environmental factors, pollution, where we live, where we go to school, the way that our communities were built, that has an impact on cancer rates, survival rates. But I know that working together, we can overcome some of those systemic inequities that we've seen for generations here. And that is the hope where I think our work intersects. When we think about community outreach and how we can continue to work with our community to make sure they have the information they need to not only survive but thrive here, there are things like language access that come to mind. There are things like culturally competent care, understanding where the community's been in order to understand where we must go in order to make sure that our community has the information and is educated. I was just talking to one of your colleagues, and we're talking in the business of service, right? It's not about what we necessarily do for others, but how we do it together. Making sure that our community partners are at the table when decisions are made. Making sure that our community understands the mission of the work that you do in the community. A few weeks ago, I joined our friend Ross Fromer, who's all the way up there, and has to deal with us on a daily basis. Thank you, Ross. To do a grand opening for a farmer's market in our communities. It is those type of partnerships. It is what is happening at Haven Plaza, where public spaces become the areas where our communities come not only for leisure, but to be educated, to make sure that they are having conversations with people who know, experts like you all in this room today, who can teach them and train them and make sure that they're ambassadors for good health, good habits. If the pandemic has taught us anything, which it has taught us a lot, but if it has taught us anything up here in Washington Heights, is that we must rely on one another to get information out, to ask questions, to ask for help when we need it, that our institutions play such a major role in making sure that the overall health of our community is a priority. As your partner in government, I know that the resources must be present to continue to educate our students, to continue to make sure that we're creating pathways for people to see themselves right here in this room and understand that they belong, understand that they play a role in making sure that our community's health is a priority. Just earlier this week, I visited the Youth Hub that is a partnership with New York Presbyterian, and they talked about the Lang Youth Scholarship. I've hired people that have come out of the Lang Youth Scholarship. There are people working in government, there are people working in our community that are interested in seeing a community that is healthy and that is thriving. And so I just wanted to come here today to wish you all well, tell you that the partnership must be true, it must be rooted not only in the history of what this community has overcome, but in the hope that tomorrow will be better. And that working together, we can achieve those things. And so for me as a city council member, as someone who walks around City Hall, and we often sit in rooms talking about public health policy without knowing anything about what we're talking about, it's important to know that there's partners like you all who are committed to seeing that change and that hope come to fruition. So it's an honor for me to be here. I'm sorry I can't stay for the whole time. I promise to look all of you up and be educated by all the work that you do. We are embarking in a participatory democracy project in the district where the community has a say in what they want their taxpayer monies to go to through participatory budgeting. And we've been having these neighborhood assemblies all week, and I can tell you that public health, when it comes to drug use, overdose prevention, drug policy, that is in the forefront of people's minds. They have been bringing up ideas about how we deal with garbage in our community, how we deal with pollution in our community, how we're dealing with our public spaces. So at the forefront of this work is the health of the community. And I want to thank you all for taking the time to be here today. And I look forward to continuing this partnership. So thank you for the opportunity. And please do call me anytime that you need a listening ear or just someone who will be committed to working towards the vision of a healthier, thriving community. Thank you.
A preview of a future U.S. House of Representative, U.S. Senator. So two more things. Just like we have inaugurated awards for our external speakers, we'd also like to inaugurate an award for one of our internal distinguished members, and that is Dr. Corey Abadi-Shen, who's just an amazing scientist, has been at the forefront of advances in research for prostate and bladder cancer. Her administrative leadership, her teaching ability, her mentorship, and a compelling, powerful voice for women in science. So we'd like to recognize her, and Dr. Corey Abadi-Shen, if you'd come down as well. Dr. Sharpless and Dr. Forte, your awards will be mailed to you at home. Don't worry, okay? And finally, there's no better way to conclude today's symposium or festivity than to hear from our patients, two patient advocates that serve on our patient advisory board. It's a group that we convene on a regular basis along with our community advisory board. It's the meeting with the patient advisory board that I find personally very invigorating. I live in fear of that meeting because I know I'm going to be corrected on most things. But that being said, if Anne-Marie Mercurio and Desiree Walker would join us, and they'll have some remarks and conclude this symposium. Thank you.
So good afternoon. Oh, good afternoon. I know we're probably separating you between this and wine, etc., but just good afternoon would be important. Give us energy here, even though we're a tag team. My partner in crime. I just wanted to first thank the organizers for the opportunity to be here this afternoon and make some brief remarks. I'll definitely try to keep it brief, but we don't do good with brief. But anywho, I wanted to say, thank you to Dr. Foti, because actually Anne-Marie and I really connected at SSP a decade ago. And so would like to say that the work that SSP has done in order to strengthen us as advocates has made the world of difference, and we keep tag teaming as we move through. So us being here serving on the patient advisory board together has been a great experience. I want to say thank you to Dr. Rusky because one of the things I thought about, it's a little over 3 years ago when I got this email, and I was just like, whoa, okay. And I was looking, thinking it was coming from somebody else, but it was actually you. And I wanted to just say that meant a great deal for you to extend the invitation to join the Patient Advocacy Board, meant a lot. And I will also acknowledge the fact that I can email you at any hour. I shouldn't be up at those hours either, but we won't talk about that. But you will actually answer. And I know that you are really leading change, and I appreciate that and want to acknowledge that as well. And so one of the things that I would say is that I won't probably be here for the next 50 years myself, but I want to say that I truly think that it is so important that we are at a time we are thinking about the patient voice in all that we do and making the patient the center. Because I often say that we can do so much in terms of drug development, but if a patient is not going to have quality to life, then what is it all about at the end of the day? It's not just about being alive. And so I just really want to say that although I encourage, and I know that many of you, we have brilliant minds here doing fantastic things and really trying to move the envelope. I am one of those people that probably when Dr. Rusky sees me on the Zoom screen, he's like, what is she gonna come with now? He hasn't gotten rid of me yet, but I just wanted to always say that I think it's so important for all that you do. Everything needs to be reflective. We need to do work that is definitely taking into consideration all people, because health, equity is a human right. And if we don't each take a portion to say we're going to do our part, because we all can do a part, we're not going to be able to move to a better society and living and making sure that everyone knows that they are counted and they are valued and important. Tag team.
How? That's all, how. I stepped into this role, and as Desiree said, my first experience was at SSP, where she was the group mentor, and I was a green-faced, not knowing what was going on, trying to listen to science that was way above my head, trying to understand how am I adding value to this, and I find myself here today understanding why. I don't need to understand everything that was on all of those slides. The only thing that I need to understand is how that's going to impact the lives of the community that's being served here by this great institution, and the richness of the diversity that's out there, and the way that the community outreach and the teams are going into the community to address what's happening on the ground so you can bring it back into the hospital. I remember sitting at one of the first meetings and I said, you need to like take the Field of Dreams message. It's not if you build it, they will come. You need to break out the walls of this place and get into the community to make sure you're serving the population that's out there. And this area is a microcosm that pretty much we're going to find every other population that exists on the globe if you just go slightly beyond. So what's happening here is going to have a global impact, and I believe that over the next 50 years, the promise of precision medicine is going to be happening at Columbia, that no patient gets left behind. And that's what I hope to see. No patient gets left behind. And that's what I see happening with basic science researchers and with the community outreach team and with my partner in crime. So thank you for giving us the opportunity, Dr. R, to close this out for you, this session today. I think this is a fitting way to say you guys are making an impact where it matters most, and that's in the clinic rooms where the patients are seated. So thank you.
So in addition to the Patient Advisory Board, we have a Community Advisory Board that convenes on a regular basis under Dr. Mary Beth Terry, and she alluded to that. And then another organization that's extremely helpful to us is our Cancer Advisory Council. We meet with them regularly, but more than that, they provide an amazing amount of advice, input, and support on a regular basis, daily, weekly, and many of them here are in the second row, so please join me in thanking them as well. So we'll adjourn now. Reception on the fourth floor, some posters surrounding that. Please reaffirm existing friendships, make new friendships, and the fight goes on. Thank you so much.
Mike, just don't let me, I'm going to